The rain comes before you hear it. A pressure change in the air, a thickening of the dark, and then the first drops strike the broad canopy leaves above with a sound like someone tapping a fingernail against glass. One tap, then another. Then the whole forest exhales and the rain arrives in earnest, and within seconds the sound becomes everything. A white rush of water falling through 70 million years of green. You are standing somewhere between waking and dreaming. The path beneath your feet is damp concrete, cracked at the edges where something large and unhurried has pressed through. Ferns the height of a grown person crowd the walkway on either side, their fronds heavy with accumulated water, trembling whenever anything moves through the undergrowth beyond. The air tastes of wet soil and electricity, the particular sharpness that comes before lightning finds its mark. Somewhere in the distance, close enough to feel in your chest, far enough to seem ancient, something calls out into the storm, not a sound you can name, not a bird, not a mammal, not anything your waking mind has ever catalogued. It is a sound that belongs to a different chapter of the world entirely, low and resonant and utterly unhurried, as though whatever made it knows with certainty that it has nothing to fear. The fence hums beside you. You can hear it even through the rain, a steady, low vibration that travels up through the soles of your feet if you stand too close. 50,000 volts, someone told you once. A number that sounds impressive until you understand what it is meant to keep inside. Tonight, the fence will go quiet. And everything that happens after that moment, and every choice, every breath, every desperate calculation in the dark, will flow from that single stillness, that one failure of current, that brief window of silence where the world remembers what it forgot it had buried. But that comes later. For now, the rain falls, the ferns drip, the path stretches ahead, slick and silver in the stormlight, and somewhere behind the trees, something enormous and patient is already beginning to move. Welcome. Settle in. Let whatever you are carrying today find a place to rest. Not far away, just to the side, where it will still be there in the morning, but where it does not need to press against you right now. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing that cannot wait until the sun returns. For the next few hours, the only world that exists is this one, wet and green and old beyond imagination, humming with a life that preceded your own by 65 million years. Tonight we're going somewhere that should not exist. A place assembled from the deepest ambition and the most reckless certainty. From the conviction that the past was something that could be retrieved, unwrapped from its amber casing, and handed back to a world that had never asked to receive it. A place on an island off the Pacific coast of Costa Rica, where the jungle presses in from every direction, and the animals inside the perimeter fences are not the animals you learned about in any natural history museum. They are something else, something older. You have heard the name before, of course, Jurassic Park, but names belong to waking life, to brochures and logos and the comfortable distance of imagination. What we are going to do tonight is something different. We are going to be there. We are going to walk the paths before the catastrophe and understand, slowly, gently, without hurry, what it was that human beings attempted on that island and why it came apart in the rain. This is a story about ambition, about the gap between what we can do and what we should, about power outages and paddock fences and the particular terror of standing in the dark while something enormous breathes nearby. But it is also a story about wonder, about the first time a grown adult looked up and saw a brachiosaurus in the late afternoon light and simply could not speak. About what it means to have been wrong about the nature of time, wrong in the most spectacular and humbling way possible. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. We will move through this story slowly. There is no rush here. Every detail has its place. Every shadow has its meaning. The night is long and the rain is steady, and you are warm and still and safe. And by the time this story is finished, you will have drifted somewhere deeper than words can follow. If you enjoy stories like this one, prehistoric worlds, ancient dangers, the deep quiet of a world before human memory, subscribe. A new story is posted every week, and the next one will be waiting whenever you return. For now, close your eyes, feel the weight of the blanket, the softness of what lies beneath you. Let your breathing slow, and come with me to an island that changed everything and very nearly ended it. Isla Nublar lies roughly 120 miles off the Pacific coast of Costa Rica, and if you approached it by helicopter on a clear morning, before everything, the first thing you would notice is the cloud. The island wears its mist the way very old places wear their age, not as a feature but as a condition, a permanent softening of outline that makes the jungle below look like something painted rather than grown. The volcanic rock beneath is dark and ancient, and the trees that have claimed it over centuries press so close together that from the air on a calm day, the canopy looks almost like a single living thing, one enormous green body breathing slowly in the trade wind. The island is roughly 8 miles long and 3 miles wide at its widest point. The central ridge rises steeply from the coast, and the valleys between the ridges collect fog in the mornings, holding it long past the hour when it has burned off everywhere else. The coastline alternates between sheer basalt cliffs dropping directly into the Pacific and small beaches of dark volcanic sand, warm to the touch by midday, left perfectly smooth each morning by the retreating tide. In the evenings, the light that comes in from the west turns everything copper and amber, and the jungle edge blazes for perhaps 20 minutes before the darkness comes quickly, as it always does near the equator, without the long twilight of northern places. This is the island that John Hammond chose, not a mainland preserve, not a facility embedded in some existing park system. An island! Isolated. Contained by water on all sides. The choice speaks to something important about the thinking that made Jurassic Park possible, and the thinking that ultimately undid it. An island feels like a solution. It feels like the answer to every objection, every worry, every raised hand in a conference room full of people who might otherwise ask difficult questions. What if something gets out? The ocean is what gets out. The ocean is the fence that never needs power. The ocean is the argument you cannot rebut. And so the island was purchased quietly through a series of intermediaries, and the small community of Costa Rican fishing families who had lived on its western shore for 3 generations were relocated, generously, by all accounts, with compensation that exceeded anything they might have expected, to the mainland. The buildings they left behind were dismantled. The paths they had worn through the lower jungle over decades were overgrown within 2 seasons, and then the construction began. You would not have recognized it as construction if you had watched it from a distance. There were no towering cranes, no vast poured concrete foundations, no clouds of diesel exhaust hanging over a cleared hilltop. InGen, the company Hammond had built for this purpose, the company whose precise nature almost no one outside its innermost circle understood, had learned very quickly that spectacle was the enemy of secrecy. The construction happened in pieces. Small teams, rotating shifts, machinery dismantled and removed after each phase. Roads were cut through the jungle and then allowed to partially regrow, maintained just enough for access, but never so much that they would be visible from the air to anyone who happened to glance down. The fences went in first. This makes sense when you understand what the fences were for, not to keep things out, as most fences are designed, but to keep things in. The boundary fences stretched for miles along the perimeter of each designated paddock area, 10 feet tall, topped with electrified wire carrying a charge that the engineers described in terms of precise and sobering voltage. The posts were sunk deep into volcanic soil that resisted easy digging, and each post was inspected, tested, and certified before the next was planted. The control systems that would power those fences were triple redundant, designed to the same standard as systems used in nuclear facilities. Nothing, the designers were fond of saying, had been left to chance. The visitor centre came next. Hammond wanted grandeur, and grandeur was what his architects delivered. The main building was designed to evoke a kind of organic authority. Curved lines, natural materials, glass that faced the jungle so that the view was never anything less than extraordinary. The rotunda at the entrance was large enough that a full-size Brachiosaurus skeleton, a cast, not a real specimen, the real specimens were considerably more valuable and considerably more dangerous, could stand inside with room left over for the tour groups Hammond imagined flowing through on a daily basis. The restaurant, the gift shop, the orientation theatre with its carefully produced introductory film, all of it was built to a standard that implied permanence, solidity, the quiet confidence of an enterprise certain of its own longevity. The genetics laboratory was something else entirely. If the visitor centre was theatre, and it was, openly and deliberately, a piece of architecture designed to produce a specific emotional response in people who had never encountered anything like it before. The laboratory was function stripped to its essential bones. It occupied a large building set back from the main visitor areas, accessible by a route that Hammond's designers had made to feel like a privilege. A glass-enclosed walkway with views over the raptor paddock on one side and the jungle on the other, so that the people who walked it felt they were moving through the interior of the place, rather than simply visiting its public face. Inside the laboratory, the equipment was extraordinary, not because Hammond had spared no expense, which was his habit and his pride, but because the work being done there demanded it. Extracting viable DNA from amber-preserved insects was not something that could be accomplished with standard laboratory tools. It required precision instruments, it required controlled environments, it required the kind of sustained and obsessive attention that only truly extraordinary scientists could sustain over the years the project demanded. Dr. Henry Wu had been that scientist for nearly a decade by the time the park was close to opening. He had joined InGen in the early years when the project was still largely theoretical, when Hammond's promises of extraordinary science had seemed exciting rather than concerning, when the question of whether any of this was possible had not yet been replaced by the question of whether any of it was wise. Wu was young then, and talented, and the work was genuinely fascinating in ways that still moved him when he thought about it honestly. The problem of ancient DNA is not simply a technical one. It is a puzzle about time itself, about what survives and what does not, about the information that ancient life encoded in its chemistry, and whether any of that information remained legible across the abyss of millions of years. The answer, it turned out, was partially legible. Fragments survived. Long stretches of useful sequence, interrupted by gaps where the genetic text had simply been worn away by time and radiation and the chemistry of amber, by anything and everything that the millions of intervening years had done to the material inside. The gaps had to be filled. Wu had used a variety of donor species, frogs primarily in the early days, later various other modern animals whose genetic libraries the laboratory maintained, and the results were creatures that looked right, that moved right, that ate and breathed and reproduced right, but that were not quite what the Cretaceous period had actually produced. They were, as Wu had once noted in a private paper that very few people had read, not entirely dinosaurs. They were something new, something assembled, something that had never existed before in the 4 billion years of life on this planet. Hammond had not found this troubling. Hammond found very little troubling in the years before the storm. He was a man of extraordinary vision. This is worth saying honestly because it is true, and because dismissing him as simply careless misses something important about how Jurassic Park was possible at all. He had seen what others could not see, had held the vision steady through decades of setbacks and reversals, had convinced investors and engineers and scientists and governments to participate in something that must, to most of them, have seemed at the beginning like an elaborate and expensive fantasy. That kind of vision requires a specific relationship with doubt. It requires the ability to look at an obstacle and see, not an ending, but a temporary arrangement of circumstances that will eventually be overcome by sufficient intelligence and determination. The first animals arrived in the park's early operational phase, brought to the island in carefully controlled transport containers that were loaded and unloaded in the hours before dawn. The Brachiosaurus were first, because they were the most visually spectacular, and because they were herbivores, which simplified the logistics considerably. They had been raised in a facility on the mainland for the first 2 years of their lives, not on Isla Nublar, but in a carefully managed secondary location that InGen maintained for exactly this purpose. And by the time they were transferred to the island, they were large enough to be awe-inspiring, but still young enough that the island's lush vegetation could support their appetite without strain. The keepers who worked with them had names for each individual, and those names were carefully not communicated to Hammond, who preferred to think of his animals in aggregate terms, as population and spectacle, rather than as individuals with distinct personalities. The raptors came last, because the raptors were difficult in ways that the other animals were not. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the quiet of this story, before the storm arrives and the night becomes something else entirely. The Velociraptors of Jurassic Park were not identical to any specific species from the fossil record. They were larger than the actual Velociraptor mongoliensis, which was roughly the size of a large turkey, an image that disrupts the mythology somewhat, but that the fossil record supports quite clearly. The animals in Hammond's paddock were closer in size to Deinonychus or Utahraptor, though exactly how Wu's genetic reconstruction produced this result was a question that Wu himself was not entirely able to answer. The important thing, from a practical standpoint, was that they were fast and strong and possessed of an intelligence that the facility's behaviourists found genuinely unsettling. The lead behaviourist had written a memo in the months before the park's planned opening that described the raptors as demonstrating problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the parameters of the containment system's design specifications. This memo had been received, filed, and not acted upon. The man who received it was not incapable of understanding it. He simply had a presentation to prepare for a group of investors, and a tour to schedule for a group of endorsers, and a deadline that was not going to move, and the memo sat in a folder while the deadline approached and the raptors in their paddock continued to test the fence with methodical, patient attention, pressing their weight against different sections at different hours, cataloguing what gave and what did not, learning the system that was meant to hold them the way any intelligent creature learns its environment, not as an obstacle, but as a problem with a solution. The evening before the storm, Isla Nublar was beautiful. The kitchen staff in the visitor centre had prepared dinner for the guests who had arrived that afternoon. A group of scientists and a lawyer, brought together to provide the endorsement that InGen's investors required before the park's full opening could proceed. The dining room looked out over a section of jungle that was lit from below with careful landscape lighting, and the effect was extraordinary. A wall of living green glowing softly in the warm evening air. The wine was Chilean, the food was excellent, and Hammond spoke with the ease and warmth of a man who believed, with complete sincerity, that what he had built was a gift to the world. Outside, the storm was 3 hours away. The barometric pressure was dropping. The sea around the island was beginning to move with the long rolling swells that precede a major weather system by the time it has organised itself. The animals in the paddocks were restless, herbivores and carnivores alike showing the particular behavioural signatures that experienced keepers recognise as storm response, an ancient sensitivity to atmospheric change that has nothing to do with any genetic reconstruction and everything to do with the deep biology of living things. But the keepers on duty that evening were not the most experienced keepers. They were the ones who happened to be scheduled, and the storm continued to organise itself over the Pacific, tightening its spiral, building its wall of rain. Somewhere in the central control room, a phone line was ringing. It was the weather service. The operator who might have answered it was on a break. The call went unanswered, and the evening continued its gentle trajectory toward disaster. The coral reefs around Isla Nublar were among the most intact in the eastern Pacific by the time Hammond acquired the island, a consequence of its relative inaccessibility and the low volume of boat traffic that its volcanic geography and offshore currents discouraged. The fish populations were undisturbed. The sea turtles that nested on the dark sand beaches had been nesting there for longer than any human memory, following the magnetic map encoded in their biology to the same beaches their mothers and grandmothers had used. The waters were warm and clear and full of the kind of life that reminds you, if you have forgotten, that the ocean is not an absence between continents, but a world of its own, with its own vastness and its own history, that makes human history seem, in the way that geological time always makes human time seem, brief and provisional. Hammond had stood on the eastern beach of Isla Nublar on the morning he first walked the island's perimeter. Walked it himself, not through any intermediary, because he was the kind of man who needed the physical experience of a thing before he could commit to it fully. And he had looked out at the Pacific and thought about the fact that nothing he was about to do on this island was going to be visible from any passing ship. This was not simply a logistical consideration, though it was also that. It was something more personal. The particular satisfaction of building something that the world did not know was being built until it was finished. Hammond had always preferred unveiling to announcing. He had always preferred the moment of arrival, the fully formed, the accomplished, the irreversibly real, to the process of construction, which was messy and incremental and full of moments in which the distance between the present state and the intended state seemed discouraging. The helicopters that delivered equipment and personnel to the island in the construction years flew at dawn and at dusk, when the light on the ocean made aerial observation from any passing vessel unlikely. They came and went in a pattern that the maintenance staff on the island tracked with the same precision that the engineers track the fence installations and the geneticists track the DNA extraction sequences. The pattern was not publicised, obviously, but it was not either entirely secret, and secrets of this scale, maintained over years, always develop small leaks, the accumulation of individual human knowledge that cannot be entirely contained by any NDA or company protocol. What protected InGen was not absolute secrecy, but the credibility gap. The information that reached the outside world was not believed, because what the information described was not believable. People did not bring it to media organisations or regulatory agencies because the people who might receive it would look at them with the polite incomprehension that society reserves for those who report the genuinely impossible, and they would be right to do so because what was happening on the island was, in the technical sense of the word, impossible. The first successful hatching had occurred not on the island but in the mainland facility, in the early hours of a Tuesday morning in the early autumn. Wu had been there, as he had been for every hatching in the project's history, not because his presence was required after a certain point in the procedure, but because he could not have stayed away. There are moments in a scientific life that you know, while they are happening, will be permanent, that will not be revised or superseded by subsequent events, but will remain exactly as they are, fixed in the memory with the clarity and texture of immediate experience, available for recall decades later at the same resolution they had when they occurred. The hatching was one of those moments, the shell cracking, the first view of the wet, improbable, breathing animal inside it, the sound it made, nothing dramatic, not the roar of mythology, just the small, confused vocalization of a newly arrived creature in an environment it had no framework for. Wu had stood very still and watched, and did not speak for a long time because there was nothing to say that would not reduce the moment, and the moment did not need reducing. The island had been ready for the animals before the animals arrived, in the way that any carefully prepared environment is ready. The vegetation established, the water systems running, the temperature gradients created by the volcanic terrain providing the range of microhabitats that the different species required. Ready is of course a relative term when applied to living systems. The paddocks were ready in the sense that the engineers had completed their work and the systems had passed their inspections and the protocols were in place. The island was not ready in any deeper sense for what was about to inhabit it, because what was about to inhabit it was alive, and alive things are never fully anticipated by the systems built to contain them. This is not a criticism of the engineering. It is simply a description of the relationship between construction and life. Construction fixes things in states, and life constantly changes the states of things, and the gap between what is fixed and what changes is where all the interesting events occur. John Hammond was 73 years old in the summer that everything came apart, though he moved and spoke like a man 20 years younger, and his white hair had the particular quality of whiteness that suggests not age but distinction, as though it had always been this colour and the colour had always been correct. He had made his first fortune in oil exploration, his second in biotechnology, and his third in a series of investments whose precise nature was not well understood, even by the people who'd made money alongside him. By the time InGen was incorporated, Hammond had the resources to pursue an idea that most people would have dismissed as fantasy, and the willingness to pursue it that only comes from having already done things that other people said were impossible. He carried a cane with a handle carved from amber, genuine amber, Cretaceous amber, the same material that had made his park possible, given to him by the team that had first successfully extracted viable DNA from a preserved insect. The cane was not strictly necessary for walking, it was a statement. It said, "I know what this material contains. I know what we found inside it. I know what we made with what we found." He tapped it against the concrete of the visitor centre floor the night the guests arrived, and the sound it made, clean, hard, echoing, was the sound of a man who was absolutely certain he had done something extraordinary. Dennis Nedry was 37 and overweight, and angry in the particular way of people who feel undervalued by a system they helped to build. He had been InGen's head programmer for 4 years, the man responsible for the park's integrated control system, a network of software connecting every automated function on the island, from the gate mechanisms to the feeding schedules to the fence power, to the security cameras to the door locks in every building. This was not a small accomplishment. The system he had built was genuinely complex, a piece of engineering that any university computer science department would have used as a case study in elegant design, and Nedry knew this with the precision of someone who had measured the gap between what he had been paid and what the work had been worth, and found the measurement deeply, repeatedly unsatisfying. He had been approached months before the storm by a competitor. Not directly, there were intermediaries, always in transactions of this kind, careful constructions of deniability that everyone involved understood without anyone stating openly. What was being asked of him was simple in its outline: bring out samples, viable embryos, preserved in a specially designed carrier, transported off the island in the chaos of a manufactured disturbance, and delivered to a boat that would be waiting at the eastern dock. The payment was substantial. Nedry had told himself a story about it, the way people tell themselves stories about the things they are going to do that they know they should not do. A story about fairness, about the gap between contribution and compensation, about the fact that corporations were not people, and therefore could not truly be wronged. On the evening of the storm, Nedry sat at his workstation in the control room and made small adjustments to code that no one else in the building was qualified to read. The adjustments were elegant in their way, a series of small deceptions embedded in the system he had built, designed to look like maintenance procedures, designed to accomplish a specific and catastrophic purpose. They would disable the security systems for a carefully chosen window of time, long enough for him to reach the embryo storage facility, retrieve what he had been sent to retrieve, return to the dock, and depart. Long enough, he had calculated, to be gone before anyone understood what had happened. The calculation, as it turned out, was wrong in several important respects. Arnold was the park's chief engineer, a compact and precise man with the disposition of someone who takes genuine pleasure in making complicated things work. He had spent 20 years in theme park operations before InGen recruited him, and he had the kind of expertise that comes not from theoretical training but from standing next to things that were broken and understanding, from the sound and the smell and the particular quality of the failure, what needed to happen next. He smoked constantly, the habit having attached itself to him early in his career when there were still places where a man could think through a difficult mechanical problem with a cigarette between his fingers, and he maintained it now partly out of habit and partly out of the conviction that giving it up would somehow interfere with the part of his brain that was genuinely useful. Arnold had reservations about the timeline. He had expressed them. He had expressed them in the patient, systematic way of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that reservations expressed in the right tone at the right time occasionally accomplish something, and he had watched those reservations be received and acknowledged and set aside, gently but definitively, by people who had a presentation to prepare and a deadline that was not going to move. The park was not ready in his assessment, not because the animals were not extraordinary, which they were, and not because the facilities were not impressive, which they also were, but because the systems had not been tested under real conditions long enough to reveal their failure modes, and systems of this complexity always had failure modes, and the time to find them was before the guests arrived rather than after. He had written this in a report. The report had been filed. He had come to work that evening feeling the particular resigned alertness of someone who believes that something is going to go wrong, and has done everything in his power to prevent it, and must now simply be ready when it does. Robert Muldoon was the park's game warden, a title that does not quite capture what he was, which was essentially a man who had spent 30 years in Africa and Asia, managing the kind of wildlife that could, and occasionally did, kill people, and who had been recruited by Hammond because Hammond needed someone who understood danger at a physical rather than theoretical level. Muldoon was long and weathered, with the particular stillness of people who have learned that movement attracts attention in situations where attracting attention is inadvisable. He kept a tranquilizer rifle close and his opinions closer, sharing them only when he believed they would accomplish something, which was not often. His opinion of the raptors was not complicated. He had watched them for months with the professional attention of someone trying to understand a new problem, and what he had concluded was that the problem did not have a satisfactory solution within the current containment parameters. The animals were not simply dangerous. Dangerous was something he understood, something he had encountered many times in forms ranging from a charging buffalo to a cornered leopard, to an elephant in must. The raptors were something past dangerous. They were strategic, in a way that he could not quite justify scientifically, but that he had observed clearly enough that he no longer needed justification. They watched. They remembered. They tested the fence not at random, but in the same places, repeatedly at different times of day, as though they were building a picture of the system that was gradually replacing their picture of the jungle they had been taken from. He had requested more powerful weapons. The request had been denied on the grounds that more powerful weapons would be lethal, and killing the animals was not consistent with the park's mission or its insurance arrangements. He had accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had spent a career accepting decisions he disagreed with, because the alternative was not working at all, and not working was not acceptable to a man who needed to be useful. But he had not changed his assessment, and on the evening of the storm, as the guests were finishing their dinner and the wine bottles were being cleared from the table, Muldoon was at the raptor paddock making his own private and unofficial calculations about what it would take if the fence went down to get 7 people off this island before morning. The guests themselves were an assortment that Hammond had assembled with some care. Dr. Alan Grant was a paleontologist from Montana, arguably the world's authority on velociraptor behaviour from the fossil record, a man who spent his working life in landscapes where the animals had been gone for 65 million years, and who had the quality of sustained attention that this kind of work produces. He noticed things slowly and completely, without the hurry that makes some intelligent people miss the obvious. He had not wanted to come to the island. Hammond had made an offer that was difficult to refuse, involving funding for a dig that Grant had been trying to finance for 3 years. Dr. Ellie Sattler was a paleobotanist, and Grant's colleague, younger, more immediately energetic, with the quality of directness that comes from spending years in environments where the shortest route between problem and solution is a virtue. She had been studying the park's plant life since their arrival that afternoon, and had already identified 3 species of vegetation that would not have been compatible with certain of the animals sharing their paddocks, not because of any immediate danger, but because of long-term dietary implications that the landscape designers had not considered. She had made a note of this. She planned to raise it in the morning. Ian Malcolm was a mathematician with a specialty in chaos theory, which is the science of systems that are sensitive to initial conditions, systems where small changes early in a sequence of events produce dramatically different outcomes later. He had been brought to the island as a theoretical consultant, which was a polite way of saying that InGen's lawyers had decided it was better to have him inside the tent than outside it. Given the paper trail of correspondence in which Malcolm had been making the argument, with increasing precision and increasingly unsettling confidence, that Jurassic Park was a complex system operating far beyond its designer's ability to predict or control. He was thin and dressed in black, and he moved with the slightly theatrical quality of a man who has been told often enough that he is interesting that it has become part of how he inhabits a room. Donald Gennaro was the lawyer. He represented InGen's investors, which meant he represented the money, which meant in practical terms that his endorsement was the thing that the entire evening was designed to produce. He was afraid, though he worked very hard not to show it, because he was a man who had built his professional identity around the projection of confidence, and because showing fear in front of a client was something that his particular professional culture regarded as essentially catastrophic. The fear was reasonable. The things he had seen that afternoon, the Brachiosaurus in the evening light, the Triceratops in the medical bay, the paddock fences carrying their quiet charge through the wet tropical air, had done something to his understanding of the world that he was still in the process of metabolizing. These were the people on the island when the storm arrived, plus Hammond's 2 grandchildren, Tim and Lex, who were there because Hammond believed, with the particular blind confidence of a grandfather, that children were the ideal audience for what he had built, that their delight would prove something, demonstrate something, make the whole project more human and more justified than any endorsement from a scientist or a lawyer could. Tim was 12 and obsessed with dinosaurs in the way that 12-year-olds sometimes become obsessed with things, completely and precisely, and with an attention to detail that exceeded that of many professionals. Lex was 8 and afraid of things in the dark, which was, under the circumstances, perhaps the most reasonable response available. The storm made landfall on Isla Nublar at 9:47 in the evening. The weather service had been trying to reach the island's communication centre for 4 hours. Wu's relationship with Hammond was the kind of professional relationship that forms between a visionary and the person who makes the vision technically possible, a relationship characterized by mutual dependency and mutual opacity, in which each party understands the other well enough to work with them, but not well enough to fully predict them. Hammond understood Wu in the way that executives understand the scientists who work for them, as a source of capabilities, as a person whose abilities are remarkable, and whose concerns are occasionally inconvenient, and whose ultimate loyalty is to the work itself, rather than to any institutional person, including Hammond. Wu understood Hammond in the way that scientists understand the people who fund them, as a source of resources and direction, as someone whose enthusiasm was genuine and whose grasp of the technical details was approximate, and whose ambition was large enough to be both enabling and concerning. The relationship had been good, on balance. Wu had been given the resources he needed and the time he needed, and the freedom to make the technical decisions that the work required, and the work had produced results that exceeded even his own initial projections. There had been moments of tension, the deadline pressure, the decision to accelerate the opening timeline past the point that Wu had recommended, the repeated occasions on which Hammond had presented the park's animals to investors and guests in language that implied a precision of reconstruction that the science did not support. These tensions had been managed, as tensions in productive professional relationships tend to be managed, through the accumulation of mutual goodwill, through the shared investment in the work, through the practical understanding that the alternative to this specific collaboration was not a better collaboration, but no collaboration, and no collaboration meant no park and no work and no animals alive in the paddocks. Muldoon's assessment of Hammond was more direct and less charitable, though not less accurate for that. Hammond was a man who had built something extraordinary through the force of his vision and his willingness to commit resources that other people would have considered excessive, and the extraordinary thing he had built was something that Muldoon respected in exactly the way that he respected the animals in the paddocks, as a phenomenon that was impressive on its own terms and that required from anyone who dealt with it a clear-eyed understanding of what it was capable of. What it was capable of in Hammond's case was building the park. What it was not capable of, in Muldoon's assessment, was admitting the possibility that the park should not have been built, or might need to be closed, or contained elements that exceeded the ability of the people responsible for them to manage safely. The inability to consider the ending of the thing was, for Muldoon, the specific blind spot that made Hammond most dangerous. Not malicious, not careless, but genuinely unable to see the argument that the thing should stop. Arnold occupied the professional space between Wu and Muldoon, between the scientist who had made the animals and the ranger who managed them, the person responsible for the infrastructure that connected those two realities. He was not blind to what Hammond could not see. He was also not unaware of the extraordinary achievement that Hammond represented. What Arnold had developed, over his years on the island, was a working relationship with the contradiction, the ability to hold simultaneously the recognition that what had been accomplished was genuinely unprecedented and remarkable, and the recognition that the systems he was responsible for were not adequate to the thing they were trying to manage, and that the gap between these two recognitions was the space in which his professional life was lived. He had decided years earlier that living in that space was the work, and that the work was worth doing despite the gap, and he had not revisited that decision, because revisiting it would have required confronting questions that did not have satisfying answers. Gennaro's transformation over the course of the evening, from the man who'd arrived thinking primarily about liability and endorsement, to the man who'd sat in the visitor centre lobby in the early morning hours, thinking about something considerably less definable, was not dramatic in the way that sudden changes of character are dramatic in stories designed for quick effect. It was gradual and private, and expressed itself in small things. The way he sat differently in the hours after the crisis than he had in the hours before it. The way he spoke differently when he spoke at all. The quality of his attention, which had previously been professionally directed, and was now simply present in the way that attention sometimes becomes after an experience that removes the usual professional filters. He would not become a different person from this. He was not that kind of man, in the way that some people are not the kind of people who undergo fundamental revisions. But he would be a slightly different version of the same person, and the difference would be durable, and it would have to do with the specific knowledge that he had been wrong about what mattered. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. There is more of this story ahead, patient and unhurried, whenever you're ready to return. Subscribe so the next story is already waiting when you come back. Sleep well. Before the storm, before the fence, before any of the catastrophe that came after, there was a problem, and the problem was beautiful, and the solution was more extraordinary than almost anything else the 20th century had produced. Let yourself settle into this part of the story. This is the part that begins not in darkness but in golden light, the preserved warmth of a world that preceded human memory by an almost incomprehensible margin. Amber is the word we use for fossilized tree resin, and tree resin is the word we use for the sticky aromatic substance that certain conifers and other trees produce when they are damaged. A chemical response, essentially. A wound-closing compound that the tree secretes to protect itself from infection and insects and the steady patient work of decay. It flows slowly from the damaged bark, viscous and warm and glistening, and it catches things. Bark fragments, plant matter, dust, pollen, and, if the conditions are right and the timing is precise, insects that have landed or been swept against the sticky surface at exactly the wrong moment. When this resin fossilizes, when it is buried and compressed and transformed over millions of years into the hard, translucent, amber-yellow material that humans have prized for ornamentation since long before recorded history, it sometimes preserves what it has caught with extraordinary fidelity, not simply the shape, the external impression, but the internal chemistry, the cellular structure, the molecular information that, in a living thing, constitutes the record of its own construction. The mosquito is the key to understanding everything that happened on Isla Nublar, though the explanation sounds almost too simple when you state it plainly. Mosquitoes fed on blood. They have been feeding on blood for a very long time, more than 100 million years, the fossil record suggests. And when a mosquito that had fed on a dinosaur was captured in the resin of a Cretaceous tree, and that resin fossilized over the subsequent millions of years, and that fossil was found, carefully extracted, and brought into a laboratory with sufficiently precise equipment, what it contained was not simply an insect. What it contained was the last meal of that insect. Blood cells, preserved in the amber-enclosed digestive tract, carrying within their chemistry the genetic code of the animal that had been fed upon. This is not science fiction. The process of DNA extraction from amber-preserved specimens was being actively investigated in the early 1990s, with genuine results that were published in legitimate scientific journals and subjected to the usual scrutiny of peer review. The results were fragmentary, always. Ancient DNA degrades, always. And the question of how much degradation has occurred and how much useful sequence remains is one that changes with every specimen examined. But the principle was sound. The information was there, in the amber. Partial, compromised, damaged by time, but there. Dr. Wu's team at InGen worked from specimens that had been collected over a period of years by a network of amber dealers and paleontologists, operating under contract to the company. The collection was extensive. Thousands of specimens, catalogued and stored in temperature-controlled vaults in the genetics laboratory, representing a range of geological periods and geographic regions that spanned the entire span of dinosaur dominance on Earth. The insects preserved in Cretaceous amber were the most valuable, because Cretaceous insects had lived alongside the animals InGen was most interested in reconstructing. But the collection also included specimens from the Jurassic and the Triassic, and from locations as geographically distant as the Baltic coast and the volcanic highlands of Madagascar. The extraction process itself was painstaking. Under a microscope, in a room kept at positive pressure to prevent contamination, a technician would use tools of exceptional delicacy to access the abdomen of a preserved insect, working with a precision that left the specimen essentially intact in its amber matrix, not destroying the fossil, merely opening a small window into its chemical interior. The extracted material was then processed through a sequence of steps designed to separate the ancient DNA from the contaminating material that inevitably accumulated in amber over millions of years to identify the readable sequences and to amplify those sequences to a volume that could be analysed. What emerged from this analysis was consistently fragmentary. Long stretches of readable code interrupted by gaps. The gaps were the problem. A genome is not a collection of independent modules, each encoding a separate trait. It is a text, and like any text, it requires continuity to be legible. A page with every third word missing can still be partially understood, but a page with entire paragraphs deleted is something different, a broken instruction that cannot be followed reliably. The dinosaur genome sequences that Wu's team extracted were more like the latter than the former. They were broken in too many places to reconstruct the original animal from the available information alone. The solution was gap-filling. This is not a metaphor. It was, quite literally, the insertion of sequences from other species into the gaps in the ancient genome, to produce a continuous and functional DNA strand that could be inserted into an enucleated egg cell and allowed to develop. The donor species were chosen partly for practical reasons. Their DNA was available, well characterized, and compatible in the sense of being able to occupy the gaps without creating obviously dysfunctional code, and partly for reasons that were not entirely articulated, or perhaps not entirely understood by the people making the choices. Frogs were used extensively, particularly in the early reconstructions. The choice made a kind of biological sense. Frogs are ancient animals. Their fundamental body plan evolved hundreds of millions of years ago and not dramatically modified since, and their genome shares certain structural characteristics with the genomes of other reptiles and proto-reptiles in ways that made them plausible candidates for gap filling. Wu himself preferred to think of them not as donors but as bridges, connecting the fragments of ancient code to each other across the gaps in a way that preserved the function of the original sequence without, ideally, introducing any new and unwanted characteristics. The ideally is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and Wu knew it. He had known it for years, in the way that scientists know things that they have not yet written down in the papers that define public knowledge. The private, provisional, shifting awareness of a phenomenon that has been observed but not yet fully characterized. The gap-filled sequences were producing animals that looked correct, that moved correctly, that ate and breathed and showed the behavioral profiles that the fossil record, interpreted carefully, suggested they should show. But the fossil record is an incomplete guide, and Wu's reconstructions were composites, and composites have emergent properties, characteristics that arise from the combination of components that would not be predictable from examining any single component in isolation. There was the matter of gender. All of the animals at Jurassic Park were female. This was a deliberate design choice, intended to prevent the animals from reproducing in the park and potentially escaping or overwhelming the ecosystem with their offspring. Wu had achieved this by controlling the sex chromosomes in the embryonic development process, a technique he had refined over years of work. It was elegant, and it worked. But the gap-filling sequences from frogs introduced a complication that Wu had identified theoretically, and that the park's animals were, by the time of the storm, in the process of demonstrating practically. Some frog species possess the ability to undergo spontaneous sex change when kept in same-sex populations, a response to population-level pressures that evolution had retained because it was occasionally useful. The characteristic was in the frog's genome, and fragments of it had migrated in Wu's process into the dinosaur's genetic code. The implications were straightforward and they were not being addressed. The amber specimens in the laboratory's collection were beautiful, in the way that only things that are very old and very precisely preserved can be beautiful. They sat in their temperature-controlled drawers in their padded cases, each one tagged with its collection data, origin, estimated age, specimen number, extracted sequences, and when you held one up to the light, the insect inside was visible in extraordinary detail. Legs, wings, the individual facets of the compound eye, a creature that had lived and fed and died in a world completely unlike the one that had found it, preserved against every expectation of chemistry and time. Hammond liked to hold them. He kept several specimens on his desk, the way other executives kept paperweights or desk toys, and he would turn them in the light when he was thinking through a problem, watching the ancient animal revolve slowly in its golden matrix. He found them comforting. Not in a sentimental way exactly. Hammond was not much given to sentiment, but in the way that certainty is comforting. The amber was the proof. The amber was the demonstration that the information had survived, that time was not as absolute as it appeared, that the past was not entirely lost but was simply waiting in the right kind of stone for the right kind of intelligence to find it and use it. This belief in the retrievability of the past was central to Hammond's character, and it is worth pausing here in the darkness and the quiet to consider it. Not to judge it. Judging is for waking hours, but to understand it. Because the belief was not unreasonable. The amber did contain what he thought it contained. The DNA was there, imperfect and partial, but there. The animals on his island were, within the parameters of Wu's reconstruction, what the Cretaceous had produced. The past had been retrieved, or something very like the past, and the animals moving through his paddocks were the proof of that retrieval. What Hammond could not incorporate into his model was the idea that retrieval is not the same as understanding. You can recover a text from a damaged archive without understanding the language it was written in. You can reassemble a machine from found components without understanding what the machine was designed to do. You can bring back something that looks and moves and breathes like what it was, and still not know what it is. Because what a thing is includes not just its physical form, but its history, its context, the relationship it has with the rest of the world that produced it. The dinosaurs on Isla Nublar had no history. They had been born into an alien world with no preparation, no gradual adaptation, no evolutionary memory of what the island contained or what the island required. They had the body plans of ancient animals and the gaps filled by modern ones, and they were finding out day by day and test by test what they were capable of. Outside the laboratory, as the evening approached the hour when the storm would begin to make itself felt, the amber in its cases glowed with the stored light of millions of years. The insects inside were perfectly still. They had been perfectly still for longer than the human species had existed. They would be perfectly still for much longer still, regardless of what the night might bring. The word DNA was not in common public understanding in the decade when InGen began its work. It had entered scientific vocabulary decades earlier, following Watson and Crick's elucidation of the double helix structure in 1953, and it had made its way into popular culture gradually and incompletely, the way most scientific concepts travel, arriving first as a specialty vocabulary, then as a metaphor for complexity, then as a shorthand for identity and inheritance, and finally as a word that most people could use in a sentence without quite knowing what it referred to. By the time Wu was extracting sequences from Cretaceous amber, DNA was in newspaper headlines and courtroom testimony and the vocabulary of crime fiction, but its actual nature, the specific chemistry of it, the relationship between its sequence and the organisms it encodes, the extraordinary and still incompletely understood process by which a linear molecule of 4 repeating chemical units produces, through a cascade of interactions too intricate to fully describe, a living animal, remained genuinely obscure to almost everyone outside the small community of molecular biologists who had dedicated their careers to understanding it. The polymerase chain reaction, PCR, was the technical breakthrough that made ancient DNA work possible in practical terms. Developed in the mid-1980s by Kerry Mullis, who would receive the Nobel Prize for it in 1993, PCR is a method for amplifying very small quantities of DNA, quantities too small to analyze, into quantities large enough to work with by using an enzyme to copy a target sequence repeatedly in a controlled thermal cycle. The process is elegant. Heat the DNA to separate the strands, cool it to allow primers to bind to the target sequence, allow the enzyme to extend the new strand, repeat. Each cycle doubles the target sequence, so that after 30 cycles you have made 1 billion copies of a sequence that began as a single molecule. The method requires very little starting material, which made it immediately applicable to ancient DNAs extracted from museum specimens and fossil material and eventually amber. The limitations of PCR in ancient DNA work are important to understand, because they define the boundaries of what was and was not possible, even in principle, in what Wu's team was attempting. The method amplifies whatever sequence it is directed at, but ancient DNA is degraded, broken into shorter fragments, chemically modified in ways that can cause errors in the copying process, contaminated with environmental DNA from bacteria and fungi and the hundreds of other organisms that occupy amber alongside the original specimen. The amplification of ancient sequences is therefore always accompanied by the amplification of errors and contamination, and separating the genuine ancient signal from the noise is a challenge that requires statistical methods as much as chemistry. Wu's team had developed their own approaches to this problem over years of work, approaches that were, by the standards of the field at the time, at the frontier of what was technically achievable. They were not perfect. The information they recovered was partial and probabilistic, the best available interpretation of fragmentary evidence, rather than the certain and complete recovery that Hammond's descriptions of the process implied when he spoke to investors. This distinction between the best available and the certain and complete is not unique to ancient DNA work. It is a distinction that runs through all of science, all of engineering, all of human knowledge about the natural world. What we know is always an approximation, always a model, always contingent on the evidence that we have been able to gather with the tools we have been able to build in the time we have been working on the problem. The model can be very good. It can be more useful than not having any model at all by an enormous margin. but it is a model, not the thing itself. The gap between the model and the thing is where the unexpected lives, the behaviours that the model does not predict, the properties that emerge from the real system that the model simplifies, the surprises that occur when something designed from a model encounters the actual conditions of a world that was not designed by anyone. The tour vehicles were electric. This was intentional and deliberate. Hammond had insisted on it, not because he was environmentally conscious in any rigorous sense, but because he understood theatre, and the silence of electric motors was theatrical in exactly the way he wanted. No exhaust, no mechanical noise, no vibration through the seat, just the smooth, almost frictionless progress along a track embedded in the road, the jungle pressing close on both sides, and the particular quality of attention that silence produces in people who have been expecting noise. 2 vehicles, white Ford Explorers with the Jurassic Park logo on the doors and a touring system that included individual screens for each passenger, and a speaker setup designed to deliver commentary without the tinny, impersonal quality of a theme park narration track. The commentary was a recording. The park was not yet fully operational in the sense of having human tour guides, because the guests on this particular visit were the preview tour, the endorsement tour, the tour that needed to go well enough that the endorsement would follow. And the voice on the recording was warm and authoritative in the practiced way of voices that have been carefully cast rather than naturally possessed of those qualities. Grant sat in the first vehicle with the children and found himself doing something he almost never did, sitting still without thinking. This was not characteristic of him. His particular quality of attention was not passive, it was active, searching, the restless attention of someone who is always working, always turning observations into questions and questions into problems that require solutions. But the moment the first vehicle rounded the bend in the road, and the paddock opened up on his left side, the thinking stopped, and what replaced it was not thought at all but simply presence, a quality of being there that he had not experienced since early childhood. The Brachiosaurus was perhaps 40 feet tall at the crest of its neck. It was standing at the far edge of the paddock, near a stand of tall trees that its neck could reach over easily, and it was eating in the slow, deliberate way of large herbivores, not urgently, not competitively, but with the calm patience of an animal whose size has removed it from most of the pressures that drive urgency in smaller creatures. Its skin was grey-green, darker along the spine, lighter on the flanks with a mottled quality that was not unlike the lichen-covered rock of the paddock walls. It turned its head slowly as the vehicle stopped, regarding them with one enormous eye, and the eye was utterly without alarm, curious perhaps, interested in the way that large, unhurried animals are sometimes interested in novel things that do not represent a threat. Tim's window was down before the vehicle had fully stopped. The rain was light at that point, the outer edge of the weather system, the advanced scouts of the storm that was still organising itself over the Pacific, and he was leaning out with a focus that Grant recognised, because it was the same focus he brought to fossils, the complete attention of someone who's been waiting for a thing their entire conscious life and is now in the presence of it and wants to use every available sense before the opportunity ends. The Brachiosaurus lifted its head and made a sound. It was not a roar or a bellow, nothing like the dramatic vocalizations of movie imagination. It was low, resonant, something between a moan and a song, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than its throat, from the whole barrel of its chest perhaps, or from the part of its biology that had been producing sounds for longer than this island existed. The sound moved through the air and through the wet ground and through the seats of the electric vehicles and through the chests of the people sitting in them, and it was impossible to hear without feeling that you were being communicated with, though what was being communicated was not translatable into any human language. Ellie had her door open. She was looking not at the Brachiosaurus but at the vegetation it was feeding on, because this was how her attention worked, not in opposition to Grant's, not less engaged but differently directed toward the things that the grand spectacle was rooted in and made possible by. The trees the animal was feeding from were not quite right. They were visually impressive, tall, densely canopied, lush in the way of tropical trees that have had years of undisturbed growth, but the species composition was off. The designers of the park's vegetation had worked from fossil evidence and had done their best, but best is a relative term when the reference material consists of impressions in stone. What they had produced was a plausible approximation of Cretaceous tropical vegetation, built from modern species selected for their resemblance to what the evidence suggested, and it was both beautiful and subtly wrong in ways that only someone with Ellie's specific expertise would notice. Malcolm was watching the fence, not the Brachiosaurus, not the vegetation, not the sky where the clouds were beginning to stack with the particular architectural quality of a weather system that knows where it is going. The fence. He was watching the fence the way he watched everything, as a system, a set of relationships between components, a structure whose behaviour under stress could be predicted from its current state if you understood the mathematics well enough. The fence was electrified, carrying its design charge, ticking faintly in the wet air with the sound of current crossing a gap. He was thinking about the power grid. He was thinking about what happens to systems designed with redundancies when the redundancies themselves are subject to the same conditions as the primary systems. Gennaro was thinking about liability. This was not a failure of imagination on his part. It was the occupational lens through which his entire professional world was viewed, the filter that turned every experience into a risk assessment, and every risk assessment into a question about financial exposure. The Brachiosaurus was genuinely extraordinary, he acknowledged this honestly. He had not expected to be as affected by it as he was. But the attorney's mind works on multiple tracks simultaneously, and while one track was genuinely awed by the animal in front of him, another was calculating what it would cost if a vehicle were damaged, if a guest were injured, if any of the dozen scenarios that Liability Counsel imagined in quiet moments were to actually occur on this island. The vehicles moved on. The rain was heavier now, the outer bands of the storm properly organised, not yet the full weight of what was coming, but enough to obscure the road markings and to make the jungle on both sides look darker and closer than it had in the dry afternoon. The speaker system in the vehicle described the next stop in the tour, the Dilophosaurus Paddock, where the animals were typically visible in the late afternoon but which, the recording noted with the diplomatic caution of all pre-recorded commentary, was subject to the animals' own preferences for visibility and could not be guaranteed. The Dilophosaurus Paddock was empty when they arrived, or appeared to be. The trees were dense and the rain was limiting visibility to perhaps 30 yards, and the animals were not where the tour system indicated they were typically located. This was not alarming in itself. Animals moved. Animals chose shelter from rain, or simply moved to a different section of the paddock for reasons unconnected to the rain. The vehicles waited at the designated stop for the designated time, and no Dilophosaurus appeared, and the vehicles moved on. What was less easily explained was the behaviour of the tracking system. The Dilophosaurus were tagged, as all the park's animals were tagged, with subcutaneous transponders that broadcast their location to the park's central tracking system. The tracking system showed all 4 animals in the eastern section of the paddock, but the cameras covering the eastern section showed nothing. The cameras were not malfunctioning. Their diagnostic readouts were clean, their feeds were updating normally. They simply showed empty jungle, undisturbed by anything moving through it. The discrepancy was logged by the system. It was not flagged for immediate review. The algorithm that determined what constituted a priority alert had been tuned by the programmers who built it to avoid producing false positives, and a 4-animal tracking discrepancy in a moderate storm was within the parameters of acceptable noise. The Tyrannosaurus paddock was the largest on the tour route, a broad open area backed by jungle, with a section of open ground that the designers had created specifically because an animal of that size required open ground to be visible from the tour vehicles, and visible was the entire purpose of the tour. The tracking system showed the animal in the eastern corner of the paddock, near the boundary fence. The cameras confirmed this, a large shape, partially obscured by trees, moving with the slow weight that the system's size demanded. Hammond, watching from the control room via the tour vehicle's cameras, felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that is performing as designed. The children in the front vehicle were having a different experience. Lex had retreated from the window and was sitting very still with the controlled stillness of someone who is frightened, and has decided that not moving is the appropriate response to the thing that frightens them. Tim had the vehicle's intercom open and was asking the tour system questions that the system was not designed to answer. Not basic orientation questions, but specific biological queries, questions about feeding behaviour and territorial range and the evidence in the fossil record for group hunting, questions that revealed a depth of preparation that Grant, listening, found both remarkable and somewhat poignant. The system answered the questions it could answer and politely redirected the rest. The tour was supposed to end at the visitor centre, with the endorsers having seen enough of the park's main attractions to form the impressions Hammond needed them to form. It did not end at the visitor centre. It ended, in a different sense, in the Tyrannosaurus paddock, in the rain and the dark, with the fence gone quiet and the cars stopped and something enormous beginning to move through the trees. But that story belongs to a later chapter of this night, and this chapter belongs to the before, the still hopeful, still beautiful, still intact before, and the before deserves its own completeness before the after begins. The rain fell on the tour vehicles and on the jungle and on the fence and on the dark Pacific beyond the coast, and the storm continued its approach with the patient certainty of weather systems that have been building their strength for hundreds of miles of open ocean, and the animals in the paddocks watched the vehicles pass with the particular quality of attention that very intelligent animals direct toward the things they are studying. The tour route had been designed with the input of 3 separate consulting firms, one specializing in theme park experience design, one in wildlife observation infrastructure, and one in the psychology of wonder, which is the study of how environments can be constructed to produce specific emotional responses in the people who move through them. The result of this consultation was a sequence of stops that had been calibrated to build toward a climax in the way that good storytelling builds toward a climax, opening with something large and magnificent and relatively safe, moving through a progression of increasing drama and complexity, and arriving at the Tyrannosaurus paddock as the culmination of an experience designed to leave the visitor in a state that Hammond's language called awe, and that the psychology consultants described in terms of the specific cognitive and emotional markers of peak experience. The goat in the Tyrannosaurus paddock was a practical necessity and a theatrical choice simultaneously. The practical necessity was that an animal of the Tyrannosaurus's size required substantial caloric intake, and the feeding schedule had to be timed around the tour visits to ensure that the animal was visible and alert rather than torpid from a recent large meal. The theatrical choice was that a live prey animal in the paddock was, in the consultant's assessment, considerably more emotionally impactful for tour visitors than the alternative methods of delivery. Hammond had required that this aspect of the tour be framed as natural behaviour, which it was, in the sense that predators do eat prey animals, rather than as feeding time, which would have implied a management relationship between the park and the animal that disrupted the wilderness aesthetic he was working to create. The electric vehicles themselves had been through extensive testing before the tour route was finalised. The track guidance system, the wire embedded in the road surface that the vehicles followed, had been tested for reliability under every weather condition that the island was likely to encounter, including the kind of major storm that the meteorological data suggested would occur several times per year. The results of this testing had shown the system to be robust under most conditions, with one exception. Sustained power fluctuations above a certain threshold could disrupt the guidance signal in ways that caused the vehicles to halt rather than continue. The system was designed to halt rather than continue under these conditions because halting was safer than undirected movement. The testing report had noted this as a known limitation and had recommended that tours be suspended when weather conditions reached a specified severity threshold. The recommendation was in the documentation. The protocol had not been incorporated into the automated decision system. Grant's experience of the Brachiosaurus in the evening light was, in a sense, the experience that all of Jurassic Park had been built to produce, the moment of confrontation with the genuinely impossible made real, the expansion of the world beyond the boundaries it was believed to have. Hammond had designed for this experience, had spent hundreds of millions of dollars and decades of effort creating the conditions in which this experience could occur, and the experience had occurred exactly as designed, and it had been everything Hammond hoped it would be. Grant standing in the rainlight looking up at an animal that should not have existed, unable to speak, his professional distance entirely dissolved by the simple fact of the thing's presence. This was the proof Hammond had been assembling all his adult life, not the scientific proof which the laboratory provided, the human proof, the demonstration that what had been done was worth doing, that the world was larger and stranger and more wonderful for having it. The island's power grid was not a simple thing. It had been designed with what the engineers called defense in depth, a layered approach to redundancy in which each critical system had a backup, and each backup had a backup, and the failure of any single component was theoretically incapable of producing a cascade that took down the whole. This is how power systems are designed when the stakes are high enough to justify the cost. And InGen had concluded, early in the planning process, that the stakes on Isla Nublar justified costs that would have seemed extravagant in almost any other context. The fence alone consumed more power than a small town. The climate control in the genetics laboratory required a dedicated supply line. The security cameras, the door systems, the vehicle tracking, the animal transponders, the total electrical demand of the park in full operation was substantial. The island's primary power came from a diesel generating system housed in a dedicated facility set back from the main visitor areas, with its own security perimeter and its own maintenance staff. The backup was a second diesel system in a separate building. The backup to the backup was a connection to the island's geothermal resources, which the volcanic geology made available in a form that required considerable engineering to exploit, but that provided, in theory, a source of power that was independent of fuel supply, and therefore immune to the particular failure mode that the primary and secondary diesel systems shared. Nedry's code changes had been placed with precision. Not in the power systems directly. Nedry understood that a power failure that coincided with his absence from the control room would immediately be understood as not accidental. He had placed his changes in the interface layer between the park's security systems and the power distribution system. A set of instructions that, when executed, would tell the security systems to perform a controlled shutdown of non-essential electrical loads, including the Paddock fences. The shutdown would look to anyone examining the logs like an automatic conservation measure triggered by the approach of the storm. This was plausible. The park's systems were designed to reduce non-critical power consumption in severe weather, to protect the main generators from overload. The shutdown would look like that. It would not be that. He executed the changes at 9:43 in the evening. The control room was not empty. Arnold was there, and two other technicians whose names Nedry had never learned despite sharing the room with them for 4 years. But the room was not attentive either. The storm outside was making the routine monitoring tasks more demanding. Arnold was on the phone with the mainland weather service, trying to establish the storm's exact track. The technicians were managing alerts from the animal tracking system, which was producing increased activity data as the animals responded to the barometric pressure change with behavioral signatures that the system's algorithms were processing as requiring review. Nedry had a canister. It looked like an ordinary thermos. Shaving cream, the label said, though the exterior was the only part of it that shaving cream had ever touched. Inside was a precisely controlled cooling system, and inside that cooling system were the sample chambers that his contact had specified, refrigerated to the exact temperature that preserved viable dinosaur embryos during transport. The canister was small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. He had it in his jacket pocket when he rose from his workstation and walked out of the control room, telling Arnold that he was going to get something from his car and that he would be back in 20 minutes. Arnold said something that Nedry did not hear, because he was already past the door and moving down the corridor with the particular quality of controlled urgency that people adopt when they are doing something that requires them not to appear to be in a hurry. The rain hit him the moment he pushed through the exterior door. Not the light advance bands of earlier in the evening, but the real rain now, the first outer wall of the storm, fat warm drops driven nearly sideways by the wind that had been building for hours. He had not brought a jacket that was adequate for this. He had not expected the storm to have arrived so completely in the time since he'd checked the forecast that morning. The genetics laboratory was not far from the control room, 300 yards perhaps, along a path that passed through a section of maintained jungle. The trees overhead cutting some of the rain, but not enough, the path slick with water that had pooled in the depressions in the concrete. Nedry walked quickly, his shoes already wet, his mood already soured by the gap between what he had planned and what the weather was doing to the experience of executing it. He had imagined this part of the night as uncomfortable but manageable. The rain was making it simply unpleasant. He reached the laboratory, bypassed the security system using the credentials he had carefully retained for exactly this purpose, and moved through the darkened space toward the embryo storage. The laboratory at night had a quality that it lacked during the working day. Not threatening exactly, but different, emptied of the human activity that normally gave it its character. The equipment hummed in the dark, temperature-controlled and precise, maintaining its careful conditions regardless of who was or was not present. The amber specimens in their cases were invisible at the light levels Nedry was working at, which he had not turned up for obvious reasons, though he knew they were there, the proof of everything that had made this room necessary. The embryo storage unit was a specialized piece of equipment housed in a secure alcove at the back of the laboratory. The security was electronic, a keypad and a biometric reader that required both a code and a palm scan. Nedry had the code, legitimately acquired over years of working in the facility. He had the palm scan because the system used the same biometric database that the rest of the facility used, and he had at some point, for reasons he had documented in a maintenance report, needed to add his own palm to the authorized list. The maintenance report had been filed. No one had questioned it. He opened the storage unit, located the specific samples he had been given a list of, and transferred them to the canister with the practiced efficiency of someone who has rehearsed the procedure until it feels automatic. 15 samples, 15 species. The embryos were stored in individual chambers within the unit, labelled with the same alphanumeric system the laboratory used for everything, and Nedry matched the list against the labels with the careful attention that the moment required. He could not afford to get this wrong. He could not afford to have the wrong samples, to have gone through all of this for something his contact did not want. Outside, the power grid was responding to his code changes. Not immediately. The code was designed to trigger on a delay, to give him time to reach the laboratory and begin his extraction before the effects became apparent. But the timer was running. In the control room, Arnold had noticed something that he had not yet understood. The power consumption metrics for the security systems were showing a pattern of fluctuation that was slightly outside the parameters he was accustomed to seeing during storm responses. He had noted it. He had not yet acted on it. He was still on the phone with the weather service, trying to establish whether the storm was going to turn north or continue on its current track, and the information he was receiving suggested that the current track was going to bring the eye of the storm directly over the island in approximately 4 hours. Nedry left the laboratory with the canister inside his jacket, his palm pressing it against his body with the instinctive protection of someone carrying something fragile and valuable. He had perhaps 15 minutes before the security systems began to show the effects of his changes, 15 minutes to reach the eastern dock where his contact's boat would be waiting. The dock was not close. The road to it was a service road, not the main tour route, and it wound through sections of the island that were less maintained than the visitor areas, through jungle that was denser and darker, and that, under ordinary circumstances, he would not have been eager to navigate alone in the rain at night. He had a map. He had the canister. He had a set of keys for one of the service vehicles acquired with the same methodical forethought that had characterized all of his preparations. What he had not adequately accounted for was the fact that the island's geography was not entirely as the map represented it. That roads on maps are idealized lines, stripped of the actual conditions that make them roads rather than suggestions, and that a service road on Isla Nublar in the outer bands of a major storm was a different proposition than a service road represented on a laminated map in a fluorescent-lit office on the mainland. The service vehicle, a standard jeep, not one of the tour vehicles, something from the maintenance pool, started without difficulty. Nedry pulled out of the maintenance yard and onto the service road heading east, the headlights cutting through rain that was now heavy enough to reduce visibility to perhaps 30 feet. The jungle on both sides pressed close. The road surface was running with water, shallow but fast-moving, redirecting the runoff from higher ground toward the coast. The wipers were working continuously and still barely keeping pace. In the control room, Arnold had finally completed his call with the weather service. He returned to his workstation. He looked at the power consumption metrics. He looked at them for a moment with the particular quality of concentrated attention that precedes understanding in someone who is very good at their job. Then he looked at the security system status panel. The Paddock fence current levels were dropping, not all at once, sequentially, in a pattern that his system had logged as an automatic conservation response, a conservation response that he had not authorized. That was not scheduled for this evening. That had no corresponding entry in the maintenance calendar. He tried to reverse it. The system responded that the command had been received and would be processed. The power levels continued to drop. He tried again. The same response. He reached for his radio and then stopped, because the radio was on a frequency that went through the park's communication system, and the park's communication system was connected to the same network that Nedry had just compromised. And using it to coordinate a response to what Nedry had done was precisely what Nedry had anticipated and designed against. The fence around the Tyrannosaurus paddock went quiet at 9:51 in the evening. The rain was very heavy by then, and the sound of it was everywhere, in the trees and on the vehicles stopped on the tour road and on the skin of anyone standing outside, and the particular faint hum of 50,000 volts crossing a gap was simply gone, absorbed into the larger sound of water falling, and there was no way to hear its absence from inside the vehicles. There was only the screen in the vehicle cab, where a small indicator light that had been green for the entire tour had quietly, without drama, turned red. The maintenance schedule for the island's power systems had been falling behind for 3 months prior to the crisis. This was documented in the facility's maintenance log in the dry language of operations management: items deferred, inspections postponed, replacements scheduled and then rescheduled, and it was the kind of documentation that is only understood in retrospect, once the events that the deferred maintenance contributed to have already occurred. At the time, the deferrals were individually justifiable. The opening timeline was demanding, the maintenance team was understaffed relative to the facility's complexity, and each deferral seemed minor relative to the work that was pressing. The aggregate effect of minor deferrals is not visible in any individual line item. It is only visible in the pattern, and seeing the pattern requires stepping back from the individual decisions to look at the whole, which is something that is genuinely difficult to do from inside a busy operation with a deadline that is not going to move. Arnold had noted the pattern. He had been noting it in his own records for 8 weeks, separate from the official logs, because his experience had taught him that official logs were written for official audiences and his own notes were for himself, for the part of his professional consciousness that was always assessing the gap between where things were and where they should be. He was not alarmist. He had worked in enough operations to know that perfect maintenance was a theoretical concept rather than a practical reality, that all systems accrued some level of deferred maintenance under the pressures of actual operation, and that the skill was in knowing which deferrals were genuinely negligible and which were potentially significant. He had categorized most of the island's deferred items as genuinely negligible. The power grid inspection was in the second category. It had been deferred twice. The generators themselves were functional. This is important to state plainly, because in the subsequent analysis of the crisis, the generators would sometimes be implied to have failed, when in fact they had not. What failed were the software systems that managed the distribution of power from the generators to the various loads on the island, the systems that Nedry had modified. The generators continued producing power throughout the crisis. The power simply was not reaching the things it was designed to reach, because the management layer between the generation and the distribution had been compromised in ways that the physical systems could not compensate for. This distinction matters because it illustrates something important about the relationship between physical infrastructure and the digital systems built on top of it. The physical infrastructure can be completely functional, while the digital layer renders it effectively inoperative, and the failure mode of a digital system is not visible in the way that a physical failure is visible. There is no smoke, no heat, no structural damage to inspect and diagnose. You are in the second vehicle, and the rain is so loud on the roof that conversation requires raising your voice, and the headlights are illuminating a narrow tunnel of wet road that seems to contract slightly at the edges as the rain thickens. The tour has stopped. This was not part of the plan. The vehicles were supposed to keep moving, the track embedded in the road providing the continuous gentle guidance that Hammond's designers had specified, and the fact that they have stopped and the track guidance has gone offline is the first signal that something has changed, though the nature of the change is not yet clear. The indicator on the driver's console shows a fault in the navigation system. This is the official explanation, the one the vehicle's automated responses are producing, the one that sounds like a temporary technical issue rather than a systemic failure. The vehicle's internal systems are still functional: climate control, interior lights, the communication screens. The tour narration has stopped, mid-sentence, the warm recorded voice cut off with the particular abruptness of a power failure in a component that has no graceful shutdown procedure. The screen in front of you shows the tour map, frozen at the current position. The current position is adjacent to the Tyrannosaurus paddock. Outside, the rain falls in sheets that the headlights turn into walls of moving silver. The fence is visible from where you sit, or was visible, the top of it, the electrified wire along the upper edge, during the brief period before the rain intensified. Now the visibility through the windshield extends to perhaps 40 feet in the headlight beam, and drops rapidly to nothing beyond that. The jungle on the paddock side of the fence is a dark mass, impenetrable to the eye, and the fence itself is just barely distinguishable as a geometry against that darkness. A line, a right angle, a corner post barely visible before the rain swallows it. In the first vehicle, Tim is looking at the fence. He's 12 and he knows a great deal about Tyrannosaurus rex, more than most adults, more than the tour commentary had told them, and he is aware, with the particular awareness that comes from knowing too much about something rather than too little, that the fence's hum is gone. He has been listening to that hum since the vehicle stopped. It was there when they stopped. The low, barely perceptible vibration that 50,000 volts of electricity produce in the metal of an electrified fence when you are close enough to hear it. Which you are, which the stopped vehicles have placed you close enough to hear, and then it was not there. He tells his sister. Lex tells him to be quiet. He is not quiet. In the control room, Arnold has been working with the urgency of someone who has identified the problem and is racing the problem to a solution. He has pulled Nedry's recent command logs, found the code changes, understood in broad terms what they were designed to do, and is attempting to reverse them. The system is not responding as it should. The code changes are embedded in layers that are connected to other layers that are connected to still other layers, and the connections are not fully documented because Nedry built this system and Nedry documented it to the level of detail that Nedry considered sufficient, and that level of detail is not sufficient for someone else to navigate quickly in an emergency. He knows the solution. It is not elegant, but it is thorough. Shut everything down. Perform a full system restart from the emergency backup systems, which run from a separate codebase that Nedry had not had access to. The core failsafe architecture that InGen's original engineering team had designed before Nedry's role expanded to include the aspects of the system that he had ultimately compromised. The restart will take approximately 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, many things that currently have power will not have power because the backup systems prioritize life support and structural systems and do not include, in their list of priorities, the things that the primary systems have been quietly managing. The fence power, for instance, the door locks, the vehicle tracking. Arnold makes the decision and initiates the shutdown. He tells his two technicians what is happening and what they need to do for the next 10 minutes, which is principally to stay calm and monitor the systems that are still running and not touch anything unless he specifically instructs them to. He reaches for his radio to contact Muldoon, who is at the raptor paddock, and needs to know what is about to happen. The radio is on the park's internal communication frequency, which is, as noted, connected to the system that has just been shut down. The radio produces static. Outside, the full weight of the storm has arrived. This is not the outer bands anymore, not the preliminary rain. This is the main event, the organised wall of water that the storm has been building over hundreds of miles of warm Pacific, and it hits the island with the particular suddenness of tropical weather at its most serious. The wind is over 60 miles per hour at the coast and increasing. The trees at the jungle edge are moving in ways that trees do not normally move. Their canopies press sideways by the wind so that the usual vertical architecture of the jungle becomes something more horizontal, more fluid, more like water than like wood. The goat is gone from the post in the Tyrannosaurus paddock. This is noticed by Tim, who has been watching the paddock side of the fence with sustained attention since he noticed the hum go away. The goat was there when the vehicle stopped, a live goat on a short lead attached to a post, positioned as an attractant, a standard practice in large predator management when you need the animal to be visible in a specific location. Now the post is visible in the headlight beam, and the lead is attached to the post and the goat is not attached to the lead. The eating noise is what comes first, if you are listening for it and if you know what you are listening for. Not a dramatic sound, not a roar or a crash, or the kind of sound that imagination, primed by movies and stories, leads you to expect from a 12-foot-tall predator at close range. It is a wet, rhythmic sound, the sound of something very large consuming something, the sound of muscle and bone being processed by teeth and jaw mechanics that have been refined by 65 million years of evolutionary pressure toward exactly this efficiency. It is, in its way, an unremarkable sound. It is the sound of eating. It is the oldest sound in the world. Grant is out of the first vehicle. This is not heroic. It is not even, strictly speaking, rational, as a risk calculation performed quickly in the safety of a sealed vehicle would have recommended staying inside rather than opening the door into the rain, into the dark, adjacent to the paddock of an animal whose fence no longer carries a charge. But Grant does not make risk calculations in the normal sense of the phrase. He responds to information the way paleontologists respond to fossils, with the immediate total attention of someone for whom this is not an abstract event, but a real one, the real presence of a thing that has been his theoretical preoccupation for his entire professional life. He stands in the rain beside the first vehicle. The headlights are the only light, and they are pointing down the road, and what they illuminate is the road and the fence and the post and the absent goat. The darkness beyond the headlights is total, the kind of darkness that occurs when there is no ambient light from any source, when cloud cover blocks every star and the nearest human settlement is 100 miles of open ocean away. You cannot see what is in that darkness. You can hear it. You can feel in the ground beneath your feet the slight tremor that very heavy things produce when they move at close range. The fence moves. Not a dramatic movement, a settling, a slight forward lean, as though something has leaned against it from the other side. The fence was not designed to be a physical barrier in the absence of electrical charge. It was designed to carry a charge that would make anything touching it unwilling to touch it again. Without the charge, the fence is wire and posts and concrete footings, and the concrete footings are set into volcanic soil that will hold against a standard vehicle impact, but that is not designed to hold against the full weight of an animal that is larger than most vehicles. Ellie is still in the vehicle. She has the door half open, one foot on the ground, watching Grant with the particular quality of attention she brings to situations where her scientific training tells her one thing and her instincts tell her another. Her scientific training tells her that the rain is reducing the animal's visibility, and that its olfactory system is being partially disrupted by the storm's air movement, and that the fence, even without current, represents a physical barrier that may be sufficient to deter an approach. Her instincts tell her to get out of the car and pull Grant back inside and get the door closed. In the dark, in the rain, in the paddock on the other side of the fence, the Tyrannosaurus Rex of Jurassic Park was standing still. This is important to understand. It was not charging, not rampaging, not behaving in the way that the mythology of the animal requires it to behave. It was standing still, and it was looking at the fence and the headlights, and the two vehicles stopped on the road, and the one human figure standing in the rain beside the closest vehicle, and it was processing what it saw with the patient, methodical attention of an animal that has not survived for 65 million years of geological time by being hasty. The Tyrannosaurus Rex had been on the island for 14 months when the storm arrived. 14 months of daily feeding, of the same paddock, of the same fences carrying the same charge, of the same tour vehicles stopping at the same observation point at roughly the same time each day. 14 months of the keepers who managed the paddock going about their work at consistent times, with consistent equipment in consistent patterns. The animal had learned these patterns the way all animals learn the patterns of their environment, not through any deliberate cognitive act, but through the gradual construction of a behavioral model of its world, a model that assigned certain locations, certain probabilities of containing certain kinds of events, and that shaped the animal's movement and attention accordingly. The tour vehicles belong to this model, the keepers belong to this model, the fence charge belonged to this model. The absence of the fence charge on the night of the storm was a deviation from the model, a novel condition, an unexpected state of the world, and novel conditions are precisely the conditions to which predatory intelligence is most acutely attuned. There is a question, in the study of a large predator behavior, about the nature of what might be called patience. Whether patience, in the sense of the capacity to wait and observe before acting, is a cognitive state, something that requires the kind of sustained mental representation of a goal over time that implies genuine foresight, or whether it is a behavioral pattern that looks like patience from the outside, but is produced by simpler mechanisms that do not require goal representation. The answer matters, in terms of what it implies about the animal's capacity for future directed behavior. For the Tyrannosaurus in its paddock, testing the fence with the specific behavior pattern that the keeper's logs described, pressing against different sections at different times, showing increased attention to sections where the charge seemed weaker, returning to tested sections in subsequent days, the question was one that the park's behavioural researchers had not resolved. The pattern was consistent with patience in the cognitive sense. It was also consistent with simpler mechanisms. The question was not settled. What was settled on the night the fence went quiet was the behavioural response. The animal was at the fence within minutes of the charge dropping. Not at the section it had been testing, at the section adjacent to the tour road, at the point closest to the stopped vehicles and the humans they contained. This might have been coincidence. The tour road section was one of the fence sections it had tested before, and the animal might simply have been at that section for reasons unrelated to the presence of the vehicles. Or it might not have been coincidence. The keepers who survived the night were not in a position to examine the question objectively, and the behavioural data that might have settled it was not recoverable after the events that followed. Let yourself breathe more slowly now. This is the middle of the night, the deepest hour, and in the deepest hour of any long story there is always a stillness between the crisis and the understanding, and in that stillness you can rest. The rain is still falling, the island is still dark, but you are here, warm and safe, and the events of this night are at a distance of decades and thousands of miles, and what happened on Isla Nublar happened to other people in another time, and the story of how they survived it is, ultimately, a story about human beings discovering their own resilience in a place designed to overwhelm them. Let the fear be distant. Let the details come slowly, like objects emerging from fog as you approach them rather than as things that rush toward you. The Tyrannosaurus came through the fence at the moment that the headlights in both vehicles flickered. This was coincidence. The flickering was related to the vehicle's backup battery systems recalibrating in response to the loss of the main guidance track power, a routine process that had nothing to do with the animal or its decision-making. But coincidence in a high-stress situation has a quality that planned events do not, a randomness that the rational mind works very hard to impose meaning on afterward, because the alternative, that extraordinary things happen for no reason, is harder to live with than any explanation. The fence gave way not with a dramatic structural collapse, but with the quiet, incremental yielding of something that has been put under sustained pressure. First the wire along one section stretched, and then the post at the end of that section tilted, slowly, as though reluctant, and then the wire went slack and the fence was no longer a fence in any meaningful sense, just a geometry of metal that had lost its structural coherence, and the opening it had left was approximately 12 feet wide at its narrowest point. What followed happened in a sequence that was longer and more complicated than dramatic accounts typically represent, because real events always are. The first priority of everyone in both vehicles who had understood what was happening, was the children. Tim and Lex were in the first vehicle, closest to the breach in the fence. Grant was outside. Ellie was half out of the second vehicle. The 6 seconds or so that separated the moment the fence gave from the moment the animal was fully through the gap, and on the roadside of it were 6 seconds of movement and decision-making that happened in the accounts of those who went through it, simultaneously, everything at once, no clean sequence, no logical progression from one action to the next. Grant reached the first vehicle and got the door open. The children were in the back seat. He had just enough time to push them down, flat on the seat below the window line, before the Tyrannosaurus was on the road. The vehicle's headlights caught the animal in full, and for a fraction of a second the scene had the quality of something completely outside normal experience, something that the available categories of understanding cannot quite accommodate. The animal simply too large, too real, too present to be processed by a brain that has no prior reference point for this particular combination of size and proximity and motion. The Tyrannosaurus stood on the road between the two vehicles and looked at them. Not the frenzied charging behaviour of an animal in a panic. It was not panicked. It was exactly what it was, an apex predator in its territory, investigating a pair of objects that smelled of humans and carried light, in the rain, at the centre of a storm that had disrupted the usual order of things on its island. It turned its head. The eye was extraordinary even in this context, enormous, set deep in the skull, capable of processing light levels that the human eye could not approach, adapted to exactly the kind of dark, rain-thick night it was currently navigating. The animal moved toward the first vehicle, not a charge, a walk, measured and deliberate, the walk of something that has nowhere else to be and no particular hurry about arriving. The vehicle rocked when the animal touched it, not from a strike, but simply from the pressure of the animal's mass pressing against the roof as it investigated. The children inside, flat on the back seat, could hear the sound of the animal's weight on the vehicle above them, could feel the tremor of it transmitted through the frame, and it must have been one of the stranger physical experiences available to a human being, being inside something that was, from the outside, small relative to what was touching it. Grant was not in the vehicle. He had not had time to get back in once the animal came through the fence, and he had made the decision, not a comfortable decision, but one made from the practical understanding of his subject matter that constituted the closest thing he had to an advantage in this situation, to remain still and not to run. This was counterintuitive in exactly the way that most survival knowledge is counterintuitive. Every instinct says run, and the knowledge says that running is the wrong choice. And the knowledge is correct, but the instinct is louder. And overriding the louder thing with the quieter thing requires a specific kind of self-possession that is very hard to describe from the outside, but that feels, from the inside, like a conversation between two versions of yourself, one of which is screaming and one of which is speaking in a very low and very certain voice. The Tyrannosaurus's vision was movement-based. This was the knowledge he was working from, a theoretical understanding derived from the fossil record, from studies of related modern species, from the behavioural modelling that had been the substance of his academic career. The eye structure, as he understood it, was optimised for detecting motion against a still background, which meant that stillness, in theory, should produce something close to invisibility. The theory had never been tested in quite these circumstances. He was testing it now. In the second vehicle, Malcolm was quiet. Ellie had gotten back in and closed the door. Gennaro had, at some point in the previous several minutes, been in the vehicle, and then not been in the vehicle, and then was not in the vehicle, and the circumstances of this departure were not entirely clear to the people remaining, though they could see, dimly, the silhouette of the concrete restroom facility on the other side of the road, and could reasonably deduce that a decision had been made about the comparative safety of that structure versus the vehicle. The deduction would turn out to be wrong, but it was not, in the moment it was made, entirely unreasonable. The night continued, the rain continued. The storm made the island its own for a period that felt, to the people caught in it, much longer than the hours on the clock, because fear does something to time. It elongates it, fills every moment with a density of experience that normal consciousness cannot sustain for long, so that what is actually 6 hours feels like several days, each minute its own contained event with a beginning and a middle and a conclusion. Muldoon was in the raptor paddock when the power went down, and he felt it go in the way that people who have spent their lives around electrified fences learn to feel it. A subtraction from the environment, a quality change in the air near the wire, a silence where there had been a low-frequency presence. He moved very quickly. This is worth noting about Muldoon. He was not a man who wasted time on the transition between understanding and action. He understood what had happened, and he moved, and the direction he moved was toward the paddock rather than away from it, which is the direction that his training and his 30 years of experience with dangerous animals told him was the correct one. The raptor paddock fence was different from the Tyrannosaurus fence in one important respect. It was smaller in scale but more sophisticated in its design, because the raptors required a different kind of containment. They were not simply large, they were intelligent, and intelligent animals require containment that works against intelligence rather than simply against size. The fence had multiple layers, and the layers were designed to address not just the physical challenge of an animal trying to push through a barrier, but the cognitive challenge of an animal trying to solve the barrier as a problem. The power shutdown had not disabled all of the layers equally. 2 of the 3 raptors were in the eastern section of the paddock when Muldoon arrived. The third was not. He did not know where the third was. The tracking system that would normally have answered this question was one of the systems that had been shut down as part of Arnold's restart procedure, and in the absence of tracking data, Muldoon had his eyes and his 30 years of experience, and he moved through the darkness near the fence with the particular quality of attention of someone who has learned that not knowing where a dangerous animal is represents a specific kind of danger that is different from, and in some ways worse than, the danger of knowing. He found her eventually as the third raptor, the one whose absence from the eastern section had been noted. She was at the fence, not testing it in the usual way, not pressing her weight against it with the gradual escalating pressure that constituted their standard fence testing behaviour. She was at the fence and she was looking at the place where the fence met the gate hardware, a metal mechanism, a latch system, the kind of engineered interface that a human designer might not think of as vulnerable, because a human designer would not imagine an animal understanding it. She turned when Muldoon approached. They looked at each other for a moment, separated by the fence that still retained one of its redundant physical deterrents, and her eyes were the eyes of something that had been solving this problem for a long time, and was close to a solution. The restart was taking longer than Arnold had projected. This was not because something was wrong with the restart procedure. The procedure was working, each system coming back online in the sequence the backup architecture specified, the diagnostic checks passing, the cascade of system-by-system restoration moving forward as designed. It was taking longer because the backup systems were, by definition, less capable than the primary systems they were replacing, and the restoration sequence was conservative, taking the time to verify each step before proceeding to the next, rather than assuming success and moving on. 10 minutes had become 14. 14 was becoming 17. The rain fell on the control room roof with a persistence that suggested the storm had no intention of being anywhere else for some time. Grant was still outside. He had moved, very slowly and very carefully, from his original position to the far edge of the road, using the darkness as cover, and using his knowledge of the animal's visual system as the basis for a series of small, incremental movements that carried him farther from the vehicles and from the animal that was still occupied with the first vehicle and its invisible occupants. The grass at the roadside was wet and knee-high in places, and it smelled strongly of the storm, wet earth and vegetation, and that particular electric smell that rain brings when it falls through air that has been accumulating charge all day. He moved through it one careful step at a time, the rain masking any sound his movement made, the darkness masking any motion the rain did not cover. Somewhere behind him, in the jungle, something that was not the storm was moving. Malcolm had been injured at the moment that the Tyrannosaurus's attention shifted from the first vehicle to the second. He had been in the process of trying to do something practical with the vehicle's communication system, looking for any channel that was still functional, any way to reach the control room and report their location, when the vehicle had been struck. Not a full impact, not the kind of attack that would have destroyed the vehicle entirely, but sufficient. The leg injury was the result of being thrown against the vehicle's interior when it shifted, the door jamming against him in the movement. He had not, in the immediate aftermath, made any dramatic declaration about the severity of the injury. This was not stoicism, or not entirely stoicism. It was the adrenaline response suppressing the pain signal, in the way that acute stress reliably suppresses pain, and the injury would not fully make itself known to him for another 20 minutes. Ellie's training was in paleobotany, not medicine. But she had spent enough years in the field, in environments where the nearest hospital was days rather than hours away, to have developed practical emergency medicine skills, the kind that field researchers accumulate not from any formal program, but from the accumulated experience of situations that required someone to know what to do, and the available someone was the person with the most biology background. She had set broken fingers, cleaned infected wounds, diagnosed and treated mild hypothermia, and once, memorably, managed an allergic reaction in a graduate student whose anaphylaxis kit had been left at the dig site rather than carried. Malcolm's injury was within the range of what her field medicine skills could address temporarily, though she was clear with him, throughout, that temporary was the operative word, and that what his leg needed was a hospital rather than field treatment. The second vehicle's headlights were still on. This is a small detail, but an important one, because the headlights represented both a vulnerability and a resource. A vulnerability because they might attract the Tyrannosaurus's attention by providing visual stimulus in a landscape otherwise dark, and a resource because they provided light for Ellie's work on Malcolm's leg, and because they continued to provide minimal illumination of the road surface and the fence line on either side of the vehicle. Malcolm had suggested at one point turning them off. Ellie had declined, on the basis that she needed the light to do what she was doing, and that the risk-benefit analysis of darkness versus light was not obviously in favour of darkness. Malcolm had accepted this with the combination of intellectual engagement and physical distress that characterised his condition throughout the period. The rain continued with a uniformity that had, by the third hour, begun to acquire a quality of presence in itself, not simply weather but a condition of the world, as fundamental and unvarying as gravity, something that had always been and would always be. This is the psychological phenomenon that meteorologists call adaptation level, the process by which a constant stimulus loses its intensity as the perceiving system adjusts its baseline to accommodate it. The rain had been constant enough for long enough that the people experiencing it were no longer experiencing it as rain, as a discrete phenomenon with a cause and an expected end, but as the ambient condition of existence, the texture of the world. This is not a pleasant state, but it is a functional one. It freed the limited cognitive resources that sustained attention to the rain, would have consumed and redirected them toward the things that were more variable and therefore more worth attending to. If you're drifting now, that is exactly right. Let the story continue beneath the surface of sleep. Subscribe so the next story is there when you return. Stories like this one, waiting quietly in the dark, sleep well. There are things in this world that we understand well, and things that we understand poorly, and things that we do not understand at all. And the line between the second category and the third is not always clear, even to the people whose professional lives are devoted to moving things from the third category to the second. The intelligence of the Velociraptors in Jurassic Park sat, in the autumn of the park's catastrophic preview season, in that uncertain middle ground where the evidence was clear and the understanding was not, where what had been observed was extraordinary, and what it meant was still being argued about in papers that had not yet been written and conversations that had not yet been had. The question of dinosaur intelligence is a genuinely interesting one, and it deserves a few careful minutes in the quiet of this story. The popular mythology of dinosaurs, the one that shaped 2 centuries of scientific thinking before being gradually revised, held that they were slow, cold-blooded and relatively dim, evolutionary dead ends that had been replaced by the warmer and quicker and smarter mammals that succeeded them. This mythology was comfortable. It explained the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous as a kind of natural correction, a system resetting itself by removing what had become outdated. The actual picture is considerably more complicated. The Troodon, a small theropod from the late Cretaceous, had a brain-to-body ratio that approached the range occupied by modern corvids, crows, and ravens, which are among the most cognitively sophisticated non-human animals currently on the planet. Raptors of various species showed neural architecture that, interpreted conservatively, suggested problem-solving capabilities beyond simple stimulus-response behavior. The fossil record is not a complete guide to cognition. You cannot find a fossil brain in the same way you find a fossil bone, and what survives is the impression of neural cavities rather than the tissue itself. But the impressions that survive are suggestive, and the interpretation of those impressions has shifted substantially in the decades since the mythology established itself. Wu's genetic reconstruction had enhanced what was already there. This was not entirely intentional. The gap-filling process was not precise enough for the intentions of the people doing it to be reliably reflected in the outcomes, and some of the characteristics that emerged in the raptors were emergent properties of the combination of ancestral and gap-filling sequences rather than designed outcomes. The intelligence was one of these. Wu had anticipated cognitive complexity. He had not fully anticipated the specific form it would take. The patience, the cooperative problem-solving, the apparent theory of mind that the animals demonstrated when they were observed, interacting with each other and with the limitations of their environment. Theory of mind is the ability to attribute mental states to others, to understand that other beings have beliefs and intentions and knowledge that may differ from your own, and to use that understanding as a basis for predicting and influencing behavior. In human psychology, it is considered a significant milestone in cognitive development, typically emerging in children around age 4, and its presence is used as a marker for the kind of social intelligence that underlies complex cooperative behavior. Its presence in the raptors had been observed by the park's behaviorists in a series of incidents during the months before the storm that were individually explicable as coincidence and collectively inexplicable as anything other than evidence of coordinated strategic behavior. One incident in particular had been the subject of a memo that sat in the same folder as Muldoon's containment report, a feeding exercise in which a keeper had entered the raptor paddock to address a stuck gate mechanism, accompanied by 2 colleagues who remained outside the fence as protocol required. The raptor that had been at the gate when the keeper entered moved to the back of the paddock. The 2 raptors that had been at the back of the paddock did not join it. They moved to positions on either side of the keeper, maintaining a distance that was just beyond the keeper's comfortable peripheral vision on each side, and remained there, not approaching, not making aggressive displays, simply present at that particular distance, while the raptor that had moved to the back of the paddock circled slowly around toward the gate. The keeper recognized what was happening and left the paddock before the circling was complete. The keeper was experienced and perceptive and had worked with dangerous animals for years. The recognition came in time, but the incident had been observed and recorded, and the recorded observation was unambiguous. The raptors had employed a diversion and a flanking maneuver. One animal had drawn the keeper's attention forward, while two others positioned themselves to limit lateral visibility, while the fourth, this was a 4-animal paddock, maneuvered to cut off the exit. The coordination had required each animal to understand not just its own position relative to the keeper, but the keeper's field of view, the keeper's likely attention, and the positions of the other animals. Information about the mental states of multiple other beings, held in mind simultaneously and acted upon. This is what Muldoon was thinking about in the darkness near the raptor fence as the storm reached its peak. Not in those terms, Muldoon did not think in academic terms, but in the practical translation of those terms, which was, they know what I know, and they know what I don't know, and the way I move through this situation needs to account for the fact that I am not dealing with animals that are reacting to me, but with animals that are actively thinking about me. He moved slowly. He kept his back to the fence rather than to the jungle behind him. He watched the 2 raptors he could see with the specific kind of not watching that experienced large animal handlers develop, tracking them from the peripheral vision rather than the central focus, because the central focus draws corresponding focus, and focus was not what he wanted right now. The 3rd raptor was still not located. This was the problem. He knew where 2 were. He did not know where 1 was, and the one he didn't know about was by definition in a location that he could not see from his current position, doing something that he could not observe, and in his experience the dangerous thing about dangerous animals was always the one you could not see. He began to work his way around the perimeter. The ground near the fence was wet and soft, and his boots left clear prints in the mud that he could see in the limited light from the maintenance facility behind him. A secondary concern since the raptors were not going to be tracking him by footprint, but the softness also meant that his movement was slowed by the give of the ground, that each step required more effort than usual, and that the sound of each step was more substantial than it would have been on firmer ground. The rain was still coming down hard and the wind was variable, gusting and then dropping and then gusting again, which made any assessment of downwind direction unreliable, and therefore made any assumption about the olfactory information the raptors were receiving approximate at best. He found the 3rd raptor at the corner post of the paddock where the perimeter fence met the service road gate. She was doing exactly what she had been doing when he had found her at the latch earlier in the evening, studying the hardware. In the time since his first observation, she had apparently worked the problem from multiple angles. The fence was slightly deformed near the gatepost in a way it had not been before, the deformation consistent with sustained pressure applied from the inside at a calculated point, rather than random force applied anywhere. She had been testing the structural limits of the fastening, not with her full strength, but with graduated increments, the way an engineer tests a material's tolerance, increasing the load incrementally and observing the result. When Muldoon approached, she turned to face him. And here is the thing that was hardest to communicate about the raptors in every report and memo that had been written about them, the thing that no technical language quite captured, the way they looked at you. It was not the way other large predators looked at you, which was the look of assessment, the calculation of threat level, the weighing of attack versus avoidance. It was something more complex than that. It was, if you were being honest with yourself and willing to use the word, a studying look. The kind of look that a person might give a problem they were trying to solve. The kind of look that implied not just perception, but comprehension. The sense that the animal was not simply receiving information about you, but was actively constructing a model of you, incorporating your behaviour into a framework that would inform future decisions. Muldoon held eye contact. He kept his body still and his breathing controlled. He did not raise the rifle he was carrying, not because he wasn't ready to use it, but because raising it would represent a decision, and decisions advertised in advance were information that the raptor would incorporate. He had, over the months of working with these animals, developed a set of behavioural protocols that he had shared with no one, because they were not protocols in any documented sense but simply practices, things he did that seemed, empirically, to reduce the probability of being attacked. One of them was maintaining eye contact without staring. One of them was keeping his hands visible. One of them was making very slow, smooth movements with his whole body rather than quick movements with any individual part. Behind him, in the darkness, the two raptors he'd been watching through peripheral vision had moved. He did not need to look to know this. He could hear the change in the sound of the rain as their bodies interrupted it, the slight alteration in the pattern of raindrops hitting the ground that indicated the presence of large forms in the space between him and the fence. They had moved forward while he was occupied with the third one. Not close enough to be threatening, not yet, but closer than they had been, and the arrangement was now almost exactly the arrangement described in the Keeper's incident report. One animal drawing attention from the front, two repositioning from behind. The restart completed in the control room at 10:14 in the evening. The systems came back online in the specified sequence. Primary power first, then security systems, then fence current, then communications, then tracking. The fence around the raptor paddock was the third system in the security sequence. By the time it was restored, Muldoon had been in the position described above for approximately 90 seconds. He would not, in subsequent accounts, say much about those 90 seconds. But those who knew him well and had worked with him in difficult situations noted that for several weeks afterward he seemed, in quiet moments, to be doing the particular kind of internal processing that people do when they have been very close to something and are still not entirely sure what it was. The fence hummed. The two raptors behind him stopped. The third raptor at the gatepost looked at the fence and then at Muldoon, and then at the fence again with an expression that Muldoon later described as, and this was a word that a man like Muldoon used carefully and without drama, disappointment. Then she moved away from the gatepost, slowly, back toward the centre of the paddock, and the two behind him moved with her, and Muldoon stood in the rain with the fence humming behind him and allowed himself one long, slow exhale. The fence was back. The Tyrannosaurus paddock fence was also back, but the Tyrannosaurus was not in its paddock, and two vehicles were stopped on the tour road, and 4 people were in those vehicles, and one person was outside and somewhere in the dark, and the night was nowhere near finished with any of them. The study of animal cognition in the late 20th century was in a state of productive upheaval, the kind that follows a period in which the dominant theoretical framework has become too constraining to accommodate the evidence that field researchers are generating. The dominant framework had been behaviorism, the theoretical position that mental states were not relevant to the scientific study of behaviour, that what could be measured was behaviour, and that the postulation of cognitive states to explain behaviour was unnecessary and unscientific. Behaviorism had produced significant and useful knowledge. It had also produced an implicit prohibition on the study of animal minds that had lasted long enough to leave substantial gaps in the scientific understanding of the cognitive lives of even the most intensively studied species. The raptors of Jurassic Park were not any of those intensively studied species. They were novel organisms in the technical sense that their combination of ancestral and gap-filling sequences had never existed before, and the behavioural literature on the closest modern relatives of the Velociraptorid lineage, birds, specifically corvids and parrots, was at best a suggestive parallel rather than a predictive guide. The behavioural research that InGen had conducted on the raptors was, of necessity, original. There were no prior studies to build on, no established baseline to compare against, no community of researchers who had faced the same questions with the same subjects. The behaviourists who worked on the island had been doing something that felt less like applying an established methodology, and more like attempting to develop a methodology in real time for a problem that the methodology had not been designed to address. The specific behaviours that had concerned the lead behaviourist could be grouped into 3 categories. The first was tool use, not the use of physical tools, which would have been remarkable but would at least have precedent in the animal kingdom, but the use of social tools, specifically the use of other members of the pack as instruments in strategies that required coordinated action. The second was deception, behaviour that appeared to be designed to create false beliefs in observers, including human observers, about the animal's location, attention, or intentions. The third was what the behaviourist had labelled, with appropriate caution, planning. Behaviour that was organised around a future state that did not yet exist. Behaviour that made sense only if the animal was representing a not yet achieved goal, and selecting actions based on their relationship to that goal, rather than simply responding to current stimuli. Whether what she observed actually constituted tool use, deception, and planning in the technical, cognitive, scientific sense of those terms was a question she could not answer with the available evidence. The behaviours were consistent with those interpretations. They were also consistent in each case, with simpler interpretations that did not require attributing to the raptors the full cognitive capacities implied by the technical definitions. The question was not resolved, but the behaviours were there, documented, and the behaviourist's professional assessment, an assessment that she had made with care and that she had communicated through official channels and that had been received and filed, was that the containment system had not been designed to address the level of cognitive complexity that the evidence suggested. Grant moved through the jungle with Tim on his back and Lex beside him, and the rain was so heavy that his boots collected water with each step, and the jungle floor was a dark and treacherous surface of wet roots and hidden depressions and plant matter that became slick the moment it was wet, which was immediately and entirely. This is the part of the story that requires you to feel the weight of it, not the terror, which has its own momentum, but the simple physical difficulty, the sheer relentless effort of moving through unfamiliar tropical jungle at night in a major storm carrying a 12-year-old and monitoring an 8-year-old who was doing, in the circumstances, remarkably well. Lex was doing remarkably well. This is worth stating plainly. She was 8 years old and she was in a tropical jungle at night in a storm with the knowledge that an animal considerably larger than any vehicle she had ever been in was somewhere in this same darkness, and she was walking steadily, holding Grant's hand when the ground permitted, releasing it when it required both hands to navigate an obstacle, and not crying. She would cry later when they reached something that resembled safety, which is where crying belongs. Not in the emergency itself, but in the space after it, when the body finally has permission to release what it has been holding. For now she was present and functional, and watching the ground in front of her feet with the careful attention of someone who has understood that the immediate problem requires everything. Tim was injured. Not seriously. A fall from the first vehicle, which the Tyrannosaurus had pushed over the embankment at the road's edge, had resulted in an impact that had knocked him unconscious briefly, and left him dazed and slow for a period of time that neither Grant nor Lex could accurately estimate. He was aware enough to grip Grant's shoulders, his weight on Grant's back through jungle terrain in rain. This was not a trivial physical challenge for a man in his mid-40s who was accustomed to physical difficulty in the form of field work, but not in the form of emergency extraction through tropical undergrowth. The challenge of navigation deserves its own acknowledgement. The jungle at night, in the rain, without any functioning electronic navigation, is not a straightforward environment to move through, even for people with extensive experience in it. The trail that connected the tour road to the visitor centre, a maintenance path, not a paved road, but a cleared and maintained route that the park's keepers used regularly, was somewhere in the direction Grant believed was north. Believed, not knew, because the cloud cover that the storm had brought was complete, eliminating stars, and the wind direction was variable enough that it could not be trusted as a consistent reference point, and the jungle itself offered no visual landmarks in the dark beyond the immediate few feet of visibility that Grant's small light afforded. He had a flare, not a full lighting kit, not the industrial flashlight that would have been ideal, a small personal flare, the kind included in the emergency kit in the tour vehicles, designed to be used as a signalling device rather than as a navigational tool. He had used it initially and then extinguished it, because the light that attracted human attention would attract other attention equally, and other attention was something he was not prepared to manage. He was navigating now by the limited light available, occasional lightning, the afterimage of the flare, and whatever his eyes could do in near-total darkness after the minutes required for dark adaptation. Dark adaptation is a real physiological process, and it is more effective than most people realize. The eye contains two types of photoreceptor cells: cones, which are active in bright light and responsible for color vision, and rods, which are active in low light and capable of detecting single photons in the darkest conditions the eye will encounter. The transition from cone vision to rod vision takes approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and by the end of that transition the eye is several thousand times more sensitive to light than it was at the beginning. Grant had been outside in the dark long enough for this transition to be largely complete, which meant that the jungle was not entirely dark to him. It was a world of shapes and gradients, deep charcoal and lighter charcoal, and the near silver of wet leaves catching whatever ambient light filtered through the canopy from the lightning-lit sky above. He moved steadily. He thought about the problem of direction with the methodical patience of someone who has spent decades in field environments and has learned that anxiety about navigation is less useful than systematic elimination of possibilities. He knew the tour road ran roughly north-south in this section of the island. He knew the visitor centre was north of the Tyrannosaurus Paddock. He knew that the island's terrain sloped upward toward the central ridge, and that the visitor centre was positioned below that ridge on its western face. These facts, combined with the very rough directional sense he had maintained during his movement through the jungle, gave him something to work with, not certainty, but a direction to commit to and adjust from as evidence accumulated. Tim roused more completely as they moved. This was good. The signs of serious concussion, sustained unresponsiveness, inability to answer simple questions, loss of motor coordination, had not developed, which suggested that the impact had been hard but not catastrophic, the kind of head injury that produces a frightening loss of consciousness followed by a gradual return to functional awareness. By the time they had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes, Tim was able to grip Grant's shoulders more firmly and was beginning to make observations about the jungle around them that were, given the circumstances, impressively specific. The plants here suggested a section of the island with higher water retention, which meant they were in a low-lying area, which meant the visitor centre was uphill, a small but useful data point. Lex was asking questions, not the frightened questions of someone trying to reassure themselves that things were going to be fine. She seemed to have suspended the need for that kind of reassurance in favour of the more immediately practical question of what was actually happening. She wanted to know where they were going. She wanted to know how long it would take to get there. She wanted to know if the dinosaurs could follow them through the jungle, and Grant gave her the honest answer, which was that he did not know, and she accepted this with a nod that suggested she'd anticipated the answer and found it less frightening than the false certainty of a reassurance she would not have believed anyway. Malcolm was in the second vehicle with Ellie, and he was injured, a deep bite and impact wound on one leg from the Tyrannosaurus's attention during the road incident, significant enough to require attention but not immediately life-threatening. Ellie was managing it with the limited materials available, strips of clothing as improvised pressure dressing, improvised elevation. Malcolm was lucid, which was saying something, and he was talking, which was saying more, and what he was saying was characteristically precise, and characteristically difficult to absorb without the benefit of a graduate course in nonlinear dynamics. He was talking about the park, not about the immediate crisis, about the fundamental structure of what had been built on the island, the mathematical description of it, the way that the park's various systems had been designed, with an assumption of controllability that the mathematics of complex systems did not support. Life finds a way, he said at one point, with a quality of certainty that was not rhetorical, but that sounded, in the context of the crashed vehicle, and the injured leg, and the rain, and the dark, almost like something other than a theoretical observation. Life finds a way, meaning not that survival would triumph in any individual case, meaning that systems designed to control life are always fighting the fundamental nature of the thing they are trying to control, and the fundamental nature of life is that it persists through gaps and exploits opportunities, and fills niches, and that no fence, however well designed, and no protocol, however carefully implemented, and no plan, however exhaustively detailed, constitutes a final answer to the question of how to contain something that has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. Ellie listened to this and worked on the leg at the same time, because she was someone who could hold complex ideas in parallel, rather than needing to resolve one before attending to the next. She had her own version of Malcolm's argument, a botanical one, an ecological one, a version formed from looking at the park's vegetation, and seeing not the impressive approximation of Cretaceous jungle that the designers had intended, but the actual plant community that was developing in the conditions the island provided, which was subtly and increasingly different from the designed version. The park was already changing, not catastrophically, not in a way that would be obvious to a casual observer, but in the way that living systems always change when the conditions change, adapting, diversifying, moving toward the states that the actual environment supported, rather than the states that the designers had specified. In the control room, Arnold was working. The restart had completed, the fences were back on, and the immediate technical crisis was manageable, but the broader situation was not managed. The tour vehicles were stopped. Two of them were not responding on the communication channel, the guest party was not accounted for, and somewhere on the island was Nedry, who had caused all of this and was, as far as Arnold could determine, not communicating and not at the facility. The control room's camera network had been partially restored, and Arnold was cycling through what cameras he had, trying to establish the situation on the ground, trying to see what the rain-blurred images would tell him about where people were and what condition they were in. The camera covering the eastern section of the tour road showed one of the vehicles overturned. This was information he had not had. He sat with it for a moment, looking at the image on the screen, the vehicle on its side in the embankment, the rain falling on it, the surrounding jungle in the imperfect resolution of a camera designed for security monitoring rather than image quality. And the thing he felt in that moment was not panic, but something quieter and more difficult. The recognition that his careful, systematic work through the last hour had not been enough, that the situation on the ground was worse than the systems had told him, and that the gap between the information available in a control room and the reality outside it was one that no system design could fully close. He reached Muldoon on the newly restored radio. The conversation was brief and direct. This was not a situation where either of them had energy for anything other than the essential information and the next required action. Muldoon was at the raptor paddock. The raptors were contained. Grant's party was unaccounted for in the jungle north of the tour road. The second vehicle was on the road with 2 injured occupants. Hammond was in the visitor centre, attempting to locate his grandchildren through channels that were currently not producing results. Muldoon was going to take a vehicle and go toward the tour road to find the second vehicle. Arnold was going to continue working the control room systems. The jungle continued around Grant and the children, wet and enormous and alive with the sounds of the storm and the sounds of the animals that lived in it, and moved through it according to their own patterns, undisturbed by the crisis happening in the human parts of the island, attended only to the rain and the wind and the particular signals that a night of this kind produced in creatures that had no relation to the concerns of the people walking beneath their canopy. The trees dripped, the frogs called. Somewhere in the middle distance a large herbivore moved through the undergrowth, its passage audible before its shape was visible, and its shape visible briefly in a lightning flash, as a large, gentle mass against the darker mass of the trees before the dark closed over it again. Grant walked steadily north, and the jungle opened around him and closed behind him, and the lights of the visitor centre appeared eventually through the trees ahead. First as a glow above the canopy, indistinct and uncertain in the rain, then as distinct shapes, then as the actual lit windows of the main building yellow and square against the dark. He stopped for a moment, standing in the rain with Tim on his back and Lex beside him, and looked at those windows the way people look at light when they have been a long time in the dark, not with relief exactly, though relief was part of it, but with something older, something that goes back further than Jurassic Park or the 20th century, or even the species that built the visitor centre. The ancient animal recognition of fire, of warmth, of the place where others are. The jungle at night is not silent. This seems obvious in retrospect, but is genuinely surprising to people who encounter it for the first time. The expectation of silence in the dark, inherited from urban environments where night sounds are human sounds, yields to something else entirely in a tropical forest. The insects alone produce a sound that is not background noise, in the way that a hum is background noise but is textured, dimensional, a layered complex of calls that occupy different frequency ranges and different temporal patterns, and that constitute, for the animals that evolved in this environment, a continuous broadcast of information about the state of the world. The frogs add their own register, lower, more sporadic, punctuated by the silences that follow each call with the particular weighting quality of a question that has been asked. The nightbirds are higher, sharper, brief signals that interrupt the insect chorus and then subside. Grant had spent enough time in field environments to read jungle sounds the way you read a text, not consciously, not with the deliberate attention of someone looking up the meaning of an unfamiliar word, but fluently, the way a native reader processes language without being aware of the individual steps in the process. Changes in the insect chorus, sudden silences, frequency shifts, the particular pattern that indicates the passage of a large animal through an area where insects have been calling freely, registered for him as information without requiring cognitive processing to decode. This was not special to him. It was the skill that all field biologists develop over sufficient time in the places they study. But it was useful on this night, in the specific way that skills are useful when they are the right skills for the moment. The path he found was not the maintenance path he had been looking for. It was older, a track that might have been made by the island's original inhabitants, the fishing families who had lived on the western shore before InGen's arrival, a path that had been used for years and had only partially overgrown in the time since it was abandoned. The vegetation along its edges was different from the vegetation in the surrounding jungle. Earlier successional species, plants that colonize disturbed ground before the canopy closes over it, indicators of a history of human movement that the jungle was in the process of erasing. Grant recognized the ecological signature and followed the path, because any path was better than no path, and a path that led to where people had been was more likely to lead to where people were than a route through undisturbed jungle. Tim slept briefly on Grant's back during the last section of the journey. This happened without either of them fully aware of it. Tim's grip loosening slightly, his head dropping, the unconscious surrender of a child who has been running on adrenaline for hours and whose body has finally presented the bill for that expenditure. Grant adjusted his hold and kept walking. The sleep lasted perhaps 10 minutes, ending when the path turned and the first glow of the visitor center lights became visible through the trees ahead. Tim's grip tightened again. He did not say anything. Neither did Grant. The lights were sufficient. The control room of Jurassic Park was, in its fully operational state, an extraordinary piece of engineering made to look like something slightly less extraordinary, because the appearance of something extraordinary tends to intimidate the people who need to use it with confidence, and confidence is what control rooms require from their operators. The screens were large but not overwhelming. The workstations were arranged for ergonomic efficiency. The ambient lighting was calibrated to reduce eye strain during long shifts, and to ensure that the screens remained readable under all conditions without glare. The whole effect was of a well-appointed workplace rather than a technological marvel, despite the fact that it was, objectively, a technological marvel. Arnold had been in control rooms for most of his professional life, and had developed the kind of relationship with them that very experienced operators develop. Not comfort exactly, because you cannot be entirely comfortable in a room where your responsibility is continuous, and where every alarm that sounds represents something that has failed to function as designed. But familiarity. The deep, particular familiarity with an environment where you have spent enough hours that your body knows where things are without your conscious mind directing it, where your hands find the right controls in the right sequence without requiring your attention to be present for each individual action. After the restart, the control room was a room recovering from a shock, not physically damaged, nothing structural, but the systems were not yet at their pre-incident state. Some cameras were still showing static. Some sensors were returning readings that required interpretation. The animal tracking system, in particular, was producing data that Arnold was treating with appropriate skepticism, because the sensors had been offline during the restart period, and the animals had moved during that period, and the system was currently attempting to reconcile its last known positions with the positions it was now recording, and some of the reconciliations were producing improbable results that required field verification before they could be trusted. He was watching 5 screens simultaneously, and giving priority to none of them. The characteristic multitasking of experienced operators, the maintained awareness across multiple channels that processes each stream at a threshold level, while remaining ready to focus on any one of them if it produces something that requires it. The tour road camera that showed the overturned vehicle, the Raptor Paddock camera that showed the paddock occupied and the fence intact, the main gate camera that showed the entrance of the facility in the rain, the power distribution system diagram that showed the current status of the fence circuit, and the communication board which was receiving and logging every attempt to reach the guest party and returning, in most cases, silence. Nedry had not returned. This was both expected and not expected. Expected in the sense that Arnold had already understood from the code changes that Nedry's absence was intentional rather than accidental. Not expected in the sense that Nedry's exit plan, whatever it was, should have concluded by now, and the fact that it had not either meant that the plan was proceeding and Nedry was simply staying off the grid, or that the plan had not proceeded as intended and Nedry was somewhere on the island, in the rain, in a situation that Arnold was not going to spend much energy worrying about given the competing priorities. The competing priorities were substantial. 5 adults and 2 children in conditions ranging from missing to injured to missing and injured. A Tyrannosaurus unaccounted for, its paddock fence restored to full charge, but the animal itself confirmed by camera evidence to be outside the paddock somewhere on the island. The raptor paddock intact, but the raptors showing behavioural signs that Muldoon had flagged before departing, as consistent with a sustained attempt to exploit the vulnerability they had been working on before the power went down. The storm still in progress, wind speed at the eastern shore now recorded at 78 miles per hour, projected to maintain for at least another 3 hours before beginning to weaken. Arnold's primary focus, beneath the multi-channel awareness, was the master system reset. Not the restart that had just been completed. The restart was a recovery from Nedry's interference, a restoration of the park's systems to their pre-incident state. The master reset was something more drastic, a full shutdown and cold restart of every computerized system on the island simultaneously, designed as a last resort response to exactly the kind of catastrophic code contamination that Nedry had introduced. The master reset would take the park completely dark for approximately 30 seconds and then bring it back online with factory default settings, clean, unmodified, with no trace of Nedry's changes. The problem was the 30 seconds of darkness. 30 seconds in which the fence power would be off. 30 seconds in which every electronic lock would default to open. 30 seconds in which the raptors, who had been probing the gate mechanism with patient strategic attention, would have an unobstructed opportunity. He was calculating the risk. This was his job in this moment, not to eliminate risk because that was not possible, but to rank the risks against each other and identify which one to accept. The risk of doing the master reset was concrete and immediate. 30 seconds of vulnerability, known, quantifiable, at a location known and guarded by Muldoon, who had returned from the tour road after delivering Ellie and Malcolm to the visitor centre, and who was now, at Arnold's request, posted at the raptor paddock gate. The risk of not doing the master reset was more diffuse. Nedry's code was still in the system, partially reversed by the restart but potentially still capable of causing effects that Arnold had not fully characterized, and the longer it remained in the system the more uncomfortable he was about the things it might be doing that he could not see. He decided to wait. This decision was based on a specific piece of information that he was expecting. The helicopter carrying the specialist from InGen's mainland security division was scheduled to land at the island's helipad in approximately 40 minutes. The specialist had clearance to access elements of Nedry's code that Arnold did not have clearance to access. With that access, the master reset might not be necessary. The code changes might be excisable cleanly, without the system-wide disruption of a full restart. 40 minutes was a long time, but 30 seconds of total darkness, with what was in the raptor paddock, was also a long time. He kept watching the screens. The camera covering the section of jungle north of the tour road showed, barely through the rain and the compression artifacts of the digital feed, movement. Something large, then nothing, then something smaller, or possibly more than one something smaller, moving through the vegetation. He could not resolve the image to the level that would tell him what he was seeing. He increased the recording resolution for that sector and moved on to the next screen. Hammond was in the operations office adjacent to the control room, and he had been there for most of the past hour. He was not in the control room proper, because Arnold had gently but clearly communicated in the first minutes after the restart that the control room was going to function better with fewer people in it, and Hammond, to his credit, had accepted this communication and moved to the adjacent office. He was not idle there. He was on the phone with InGen's legal counsel. He was reviewing emergency protocols. He was attempting to reach the helicopter pilot and the mainland security team on every communication channel available to him. But he was also in the way of people who have spent their lives taking action and find themselves in a situation where the most useful action is to stay out of someone else's way, clearly struggling. He believed genuinely that the park was going to be all right. Not the specific night. The specific night was clearly not going according to plan, and Hammond was not a man who confused a bad night with the end of an enterprise. But the park itself, the concept, the achievement, he believed in these with a completeness that the evening's events had not yet reached. The animals were real. The science was real. The thing he had built was real and extraordinary, and one night of system failure in a storm was not, in Hammond's framework, an argument against the viability of what Jurassic Park was. It was an argument against this particular set of systems, this particular set of protocols, this particular set of decisions about staffing and timeline. Those things were correctable. The thing that could not be corrected, the impossibility of the whole concept, was not, in his view, demonstrated by what had happened. He was, in this belief, partly right. The science was real. The amber was real. The animals were real and extraordinary in ways that words are not quite adequate to capture. Ways that the people who had seen them that afternoon in the afternoon light, before the storm, before the crisis, would carry with them for the rest of their lives as one of the genuinely irreducible experiences available to a human being. Something had been accomplished on this island that no one had accomplished before, and no amount of subsequent catastrophe could unmake that accomplishment or the wonder it had generated. He was also, in a deeper sense, wrong. Not about the science. The science was everything he believed it to be. Wrong about something more fundamental, something that the night was demonstrating with a thoroughness that would require years to fully absorb. The question was not whether the animals were real. The question was whether the relationship between real animals and the systems designed to contain them was stable, and the answer that the night was providing, quietly, persistently, in the form of fence failures and raptor gate tests and Tyrannosaurus tracks in the tour road mud, was that it was not. Not because the systems were badly designed, though some of them were. Not because the animals were uniquely vicious, though they were efficient predators. But because the stability of the relationship between a living thing and the constraints placed upon it is always provisional, always temporary, always subject to revision by the living thing's own persistent drive toward the conditions it needs. Somewhere on the island, Nedry's jeep was off the road. He had taken the wrong turn. The service road map he was working from had not adequately represented the branch in the road, and he had followed the branch that led away from the eastern dock rather than toward it. He had been trying to turn around when the jeep had gone into a ditch that the rain had softened beyond the point at which soil supports vehicle weight, and now he was standing beside the jeep in the rain, looking at the wheel in the ditch and the jungle pressing close on all sides, with a canister in his hand and the wrong dock behind him, and the right dock ahead of him somewhere in the dark, and the storm making everything worse. The Dilophosaurus found him the way predators find things in the dark, by smell and by sound and by the particular quality of distress that prey animals produce when they are cornered and still, when their movement has ceased and their attention has turned inward to the problem of their situation rather than outward to the environment around them. It was small by the park's standards, 4 feet high at the hip, light and fast in a way that the larger animals were not. It watched him from the tree line for a moment with the specific quality of attention that had been reported in every predator on the island, the considered patient assessment before action. Then it moved forward, and Nedry saw it, and the evening made its final irreversible turn. The frill opened in the rain. This is the last image of Nedry's chapter of the story, and it is worth sitting with briefly before moving on. The extraordinary specific detail of it, the biological truth of it, the frill that no one had known the Dilophosaurus possessed because the fossil record does not preserve soft tissue structures of that kind, the brilliant display of it in the dark and the rain, the ancient signal of an ancient predator in the act of doing what it had been built by millions of years of selection to do. It was not malicious, it was not cruel, it was simply alive, and what alive things do, in the space where the fence is not. The embryo samples that Nedry had retrieved from the genetics laboratory represented a value that was genuinely difficult to quantify in conventional financial terms. Each of the 15 samples he had been sent to collect was a viable embryo of a different species. Not the common species, not the Brachiosaurus or the Triceratops whose genetic reconstruction was well established in InGen's protocols, but the rarer ones, the species whose development had required more time and more resources and whose embryonic material represented years of accumulated work that could not be easily or quickly replaced. The specific species on the list had been chosen by Nedry's contact, with a knowledge of InGen's collection that implied either very good intelligence or an inside source, and the selection had been made to maximize the value of what was taken relative to the size of what could be transported. The competitor who had approached Nedry was not the first to attempt something of this kind. InGen's genetic work had been the subject of corporate intelligence activities since the early years, when it had become clear to the small community of people who understood what was being attempted that the company was making genuine progress on a problem that the entire pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry had reason to find interesting. The problem was not simply the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were the most spectacular aspect of the work, and the ones most likely to capture public imagination. But the underlying techniques developed for ancient DNA extraction and gap-filling had applications that went far beyond paleontological reconstruction. The methods Wu had refined for identifying viable sequences in degraded genetic material, for closing gaps with functional donor sequences, for producing organisms from partially assembled genetic code. These were methods with implications for pharmaceutical development, for conservation genetics, for any application that required working with incomplete or degraded biological information. The competitor was after the specific embryos, yes, but more fundamentally, the competitor was after access to the techniques that had produced them. Nedry had understood this, at the level at which he understood most things, competently but not completely, in the way of someone who is very good at one aspect of a problem and less attentive to the dimensions of it that fall outside that aspect. He had understood that what he was doing was significant and valuable and illegal, and that the payment he was receiving was substantial, and that the risk he was taking was calibrated against the resentment he had accumulated and the financial gap between what he had been paid and what he felt he deserved. What he had not fully understood was the degree to which the operation he was participating in extended beyond him, beyond the competitor who had approached him, into a network of interests and actors whose scope he could not see from where he stood. The visitor centre kitchen was stainless steel and industrial, the kind of kitchen designed not for cooking that is an art, but for cooking that is a service. Reliable, scalable, capable of feeding large numbers of people the same meal at the same quality without drama. It had been built to spec by contractors brought over from the mainland, equipped with commercial appliances from a restaurant supply company in San Jose, and stocked for the opening period with provisions calculated to last through the first 2 weeks of operation before the supply boat arrived. The provisions were mostly undisturbed. The dinner service from earlier in the evening had been cleared by kitchen staff, who had subsequently retreated to the staff dormitory on the western side of the facility, following the emergency protocols that called for non-essential personnel to shelter in place and await further instruction. The kitchen was dark when the children found it. This is the part of the story that lives in the body rather than the mind, the specific physical reality of being in an unfamiliar place in the dark, navigating by touch and by the limited ambient light that the storm's intermittent lightning was sending through the high windows above the preparation counters. Tim had recovered enough by this point to be mobile and alert, his concussion symptoms receding into a general fogginess that he was managing through the practical focus of the situation. Lex was moving with him through the kitchen, and the two of them were doing what children in extreme situations sometimes do, functioning with a clarity and efficiency that is startling to adults who have not observed it before. But that makes complete sense when you understand that children have fewer prior models to be disrupted, fewer expectations about how the world should work that the situation is violating. They had entered the visitor centre through a side door that had been left unlatched, the electronic lock defaulting to open during the restart as Arnold had feared, and had moved through the building's service corridors following a logic that Tim had articulated as get to the highest floor and stay away from the windows, which was a reasonable improvised strategy for a situation that the park's evacuation protocols had not specifically addressed. The Raptors found the building by following the scent trail of the people who had entered it. This is stated plainly because it is what happened, and what happened deserves to be understood in its straightforward physical reality, rather than dressed in the dramatic language that would make it seem more than it was, which was 3 animals doing what they had evolved to do, following scent, investigating spaces, pursuing prey through an environment that was more enclosed and more navigable than the jungle paddock they had been designed to contain them in. The kitchen was warm relative to the rain outside. The kitchen smelled of humans and cooked food, and the specific combination of chemical signals that predators have been reading since long before the Cretaceous. The door swung open. Not pushed open with force. It opened because the catch had not been engaged, another consequence of the electronic lock default, and the Raptor's weight against it was sufficient to release the imperfect mechanical contact of an unlatched door. She came in low and fast, her entry characterized by the particular economy of motion that the Raptors showed in confined spaces. Smaller movements, more precise, adapted to the reduced room for the explosive speed that the larger spaces of the jungle afforded. The children were already in the freezer-cold storage area, which adjoined the kitchen and which had, Importantly, a door that locked from the inside with a manual bolt that had nothing to do with the electronic system. They had moved there not because they had anticipated this specific eventuality, but because cold storage doors are heavy, and cold storage rooms are enclosed, and enclosed means the entrance is defined, and a defined entrance is better than an undefined one when the thing you are avoiding is trying to find you. This is sound tactical thinking. It is also the kind of thinking that is possible only when the fear is operating in parallel with function, rather than replacing it, and the fact that it was happening in an 8-year-old and a dazed 12-year-old is one of the things about that night that is worth sitting with quietly. The raptor moved through the kitchen. You can follow this, if you wish, from the position of the children. The sounds coming through the cold storage door, the sounds that their bodies were processing and their minds were categorizing, with the desperate efficiency of children who have understood that what they know about this situation is the only tool they have. Claws on tile. A very particular sound, not random, not frantic, but measured. Each footfall placed with the deliberate weight distribution of an animal that is navigating a new space and understanding it as it moves. The sound of an object being investigated, a rack of pots perhaps, or a preparation table, the slight metallic resonance of something being touched and then left. Then the sound of the raptor at the freezer door, investigating the door the way she had investigated the gate in the paddock, pressing, feeling the give of it, trying different points along the edge. The bolt held. It was not electronic. It was a manual bolt, the kind of simple mechanism that has been reliable since before the invention of electronics, a piece of engineering so basic that it required no programming, no power supply, no network connection, no software. A metal rod in a metal housing. The raptor pressed against the door, the bolt held. Tim had seen the second raptor come in through the skylight. This was important and this was bad, because it meant the kitchen was no longer a place with one entrance and one raptor. It was a place with multiple entry points and multiple animals, which changed the geometry of the situation from something manageable to something considerably less so. He communicated this to Lex without alarming her in the way that would produce panic rather than action, which required a specific calibration of tone that he achieved by speaking quietly and factually, and watching her face for the moment that understanding arrived so that he could continue speaking before the response to the understanding could displace the function. The response they needed to make was straightforward in its logic and extremely difficult in its execution. Leave the cold storage, move through the kitchen, reach the far door, which led back to the visitor centre's main lobby, and which had a more substantial manual lock than the kitchen entrance had had. The path was approximately 40 feet. The kitchen contained, as far as Tim could assess from what he had observed before the door closed, 2 raptors whose positions he could not currently confirm. They opened the bolt. The sounds from the kitchen stopped. This was the thing that was hardest to bear about the raptors. The cessation of sound was not an absence of threat, but its reorganization. The shift from searching behavior to waiting behavior, the quiet of an animal that has identified the source of what it has been following and has now made a decision about how to approach it. The kitchen was silent except for the rain on the roof and the low hum of the freezer units that had their own power supplies and were continuing to operate regardless of the status of everything else on the island. Lex opened the door. This was her decision, not Tim's. He had been preparing to open it himself, moving through the internal calculation of timing and approach, and she simply opened it, stepping out into the kitchen with the direct simplicity of someone who has concluded that thinking about the difficult thing is harder than doing the difficult thing. The raptor near the preparation counter turned. Their eyes met in the near dark, lit by the dim emergency strip along the floor that the backup power was still running, and there was a moment, not long, perhaps 2 seconds, in which neither moved. 2 seconds in the middle of fear is not the same as 2 seconds at any other time. It is a duration that is large enough to hold a great many things. The quality of the light, the smell of the kitchen, the sound of the rain, the physical sensation of standing on a tile floor in wet clothes with cold storage air still on your skin. It is large enough to hold the specific visual information of the raptor's posture, which was not the attack posture that Tim had described from the behavioral profiles in his books, but something more ambiguous, more complex, the posture of an animal in a novel situation processing novel information. And it is large enough for a child who's been moving on instinct for the past hour to understand from some source below conscious reasoning that the moment requires stillness rather than flight. The second raptor appeared at the far end of the kitchen, between the children and the door. The geometry was not good, but the moment was still holding, no charging, no attack, the two animals in their respective positions and the two children in theirs, and the rain and the kitchen and the stainless steel surfaces reflecting what light there was in their distorted silver-grey way, and something in the space that was not quite tension, and was not quite communication, but existed somewhere between the two. The main building's backup lights came on, not the full lighting, a portion of it, the emergency system that the restart had placed on a delayed activation to prevent power overload, coming online now with a particular abruptness of fluorescent lights, and filling the kitchen with harsh, cold, complete illumination. Both raptors flinched. This is the word for it. Flinched. A rapid contraction of the body that is not voluntary. The basic response of any animal to a sudden and unexpected change in its sensory environment. It lasted less than a second. But less than a second was the duration that the children needed, and they moved, through the kitchen, past the nearest raptor to the far door, through it and into the lobby, moving in the specific way that people move in exactly these circumstances. Not the running of panic, but the controlled sprint of function, each step committed and precise, no wasted motion, the body operating at the edge of its capacity and not breaking through that edge. They reached the lobby. They reached the main staircase. They climbed it. Above them, in the upper level of the visitor centre, was the system operations booth, a glass-enclosed room with a view of the lobby below and a computer terminal connected to the park's main network. Tim knew this. He had read about it in the operations brochure that had been in the vehicle's door pocket. He had read about the brochure the way he read about everything, completely and precisely, and with the kind of retention that some people have for information that matters to them, which to Tim meant information about dinosaurs and the systems built to contain them, and the operations brochure had covered both. The raptors were in the lobby below them, moving through the space with the methodical attention they brought to every new environment. By the time the children reached the upper level, the glass walls of the operations booth gave a clear view down. Tim sat at the terminal. He was 12 years old. He was about to attempt to access the park's main computer network on behalf of a situation whose resolution depended on his ability to do in minutes what trained programmers did over days, and he was doing it with a head injury and wet clothes and the immediate presence of two Velociraptors one level below, and he sat down at the terminal and put his hands on the keyboard and his eyes on the screen, and he began. The visitor centre had been built to a standard that Hammond had specified as lasting, not the 20-year building cycle of commercial construction, where materials and systems are selected on the basis of their cost over a depreciation period, but the century-plus standard of the significant institutional buildings that Hammond admired, the ones that had been built with the expectation that they would be standing and functioning long after the people who commissioned them were gone. This standard had been expensive and had been argued against by the project managers, who pointed out that the depreciation model made more financial sense. Hammond had been uninterested in the depreciation model. He was building something that was going to matter for a long time, and buildings that were going to matter for a long time needed to be built with materials that would last. The result was a structure that, despite the crisis, was essentially intact. The glass reinforced and the concrete sound and the structural steel sized beyond what the load calculations strictly required, because the engineer Hammond had hired had shared his preference for over-specification in situations where the cost of failure was incalculable. The glass walls of the operations booth that Tim and Lex were using had been specified to a standard that could resist significant impact from outside, which meant the Raptor's pressure against them, sustained though it was not approaching the failure threshold of the material. The door lock was manual and mechanical. The structure was solid. The children were safe in a way that depended not on luck but on the quality of what had been built. This is one of the details of the night that gets lost in the more dramatic elements. The degree to which Hammond's insistence on quality that had been argued against, that had cost more than alternatives would have cost, that had been justified by an intuition about permanence rather than any specific engineering calculation, contributed to the survival of the people inside the building. The materials held, the reinforced glass held, the manual locks held, the things that were mechanical and simple and expensive held in a way that the things that were electronic and complex and cheaper did not. This is not an argument against electronic systems or an argument for any particular engineering philosophy. It is simply a fact about what the night required and what was there to provide it. Lex, in the operations booth, was calmer than the circumstances suggested she had any right to be. This is a characteristic of some children in crisis that adults who observe it find simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because calm is more useful than panic, and unsettling because calm in a child who has reason for panic implies either dissociation, which is a protective response but a concerning one, or a fundamental temperamental quality that most adults do not possess in the same form. Lex's calm was not dissociation. She was aware of the situation and was making sense of it in real time with the specific kind of real-time sense-making that children who have been given the freedom to develop it bring to situations that most adults find overwhelming. She was not managing the situation. She was in it completely, attending to what it required, which was different from managing it, and on this particular night, more useful. There is a quality to the work of understanding a system that someone else has built that is different from any other intellectual experience, not better or worse, but specific to itself. You come to the work without the context of the builder, without the hundreds of small decisions that accumulated into the structure you're examining, and you have to reconstruct those decisions from their effects, working backward from what exists to why it exists, building a picture of someone else's thinking from the evidence they left behind in the structure of what they made. This is what archaeologists do. It is what anatomists do. It is, in a certain sense, what Tim Murphy was attempting at the operations terminal in the glass booth above the raptor-occupied lobby, and it is one of the reasons that the story of what he accomplished there has a quality that exceeds simple narrative heroics. The park's computer system was complex. This is not an overstatement. It was genuinely complex in the sense that complexity has a technical meaning, the sense in which a system's behavior cannot be fully predicted from knowledge of its individual components because the interactions between components produce emergent behaviors that are not present in any individual component alone. Nedry had built it over 4 years and had documented it to the level he considered necessary, and that level was sufficient for routine operation but not for the kind of rapid, improvised intervention that the crisis demanded. Arnold, in the control room, had been working through the system for an hour. He understood it professionally but not completely. The distinction between competent and complete is important here. The difference between someone who can operate a system and someone who understands the system at the level of its own internal logic. Nedry was the second kind, and Nedry was not in the building, and the result was a control room full of systems that were functioning, but whose precise status was unclear in the ways that matter, the ways that would tell Arnold whether the raptors had anything else to exploit, whether the Tyrannosaurus's position was tracked reliably, whether the master reset was safe or not. Tim had come to the terminal with a specific piece of knowledge. He had read, in the operations brochure, that the park's main computer system used a Unix-based operating system for its core functions, with a proprietary graphical interface built on top of it. The graphical interface was what normal operators saw. Beneath it was the standard Unix command line, which was accessible through a specific key sequence, and the standard Unix command line was something that Tim had learned, not as a practical skill for anything specific, but the way he learned most things, because it was interesting and detailed, and because the internet, which was still young but was already full of detailed documentation, had provided him with enough material to build a working understanding of how the system operated. He found the key sequence, the interface dropped away. The command line was there. Clean text on a dark screen, the prompt blinking with a steadiness that was itself a kind of reassurance, the basic machine logic unaffected by everything that had been done to the layers above it. He typed a command to list the file system. The file system was there. He typed a command to show running processes. The processes were there. He could see, in the list of running processes, the names of the critical functions. The fence control daemon, the security camera management process, the door lock coordinator. And he could see, adjacent to those names, the modified versions of those processes that Nedry's code had introduced. Not the originals, but their altered duplicates, carrying the changes that Arnold could see in their effects, but could not reach through the graphical interface that had been built on top of them. The raptor outside the operations booth door had been there for approximately 4 minutes. Tim was aware of this. Lex had moved to the back of the booth and was doing the thing she'd been doing since the kitchen, functioning. She had found a headset connected to the communication system and was attempting to reach the control room on every channel available, working through the panel with systematic attention that she maintained despite the raptor's presence outside the glass. The glass was reinforced, the The door had a physical lock, not electronic. The raptor was pressing against the glass with a quality of pressure that was not quite force and not quite investigation, but something between the two. The sustained weight of an animal that is determining whether the surface it is pressing against will yield. Tim's hands were shaking. This is a physiological response to the combination of adrenaline and the fine motor demands of precise keyboard work, and it is not something that can be controlled by deciding not to be afraid, though people attempt this. What can be controlled is the attention, the focus that narrows to the immediate task and excludes the peripheral information, the shaking and the breathing and the raptor and the glass, and directs everything available toward the problem in front of it. He controlled this, he typed carefully. What he found in the process files was a pattern. Nedry's code changes were not random. They had a logic, the logic of someone who had built the system and understood how its components connected to each other, and that logic was visible in the pattern of which processes had been modified and which had not. The modified processes were clustered around the security systems, fences, doors, cameras, and they were connected to each other by a common thread, a shared variable that each modified process referenced, a variable that, if changed, would cascade through all of them simultaneously, reversing the modifications in a single operation rather than requiring each one to be addressed individually. Arnold had not found this variable because he was navigating from the top of the system, the graphical interface, the management console, the tools that Nedry had documented, and the variable was not visible from those levels. It was a core system variable, embedded in the foundational layer that Nedry had modified before any of the upper layers were built, and it was accessible only from the command line, from the layer below the layer that the documentation described. Lex had reached the control room. Arnold's voice in the headset, scratchy with the limits of the backup communication system but unmistakably his, was the first adult contact they had had since the kitchen. The conversation was brief. Arnold was in the middle of 3 other things, but it was enough. He told them where the Tyrannosaurus was approximately. He told them where Grant and Ellie and Malcolm were approximately. He told them what he needed. The system variable changed. The restoration command executed from a terminal with direct access to the Unix layer. Tim typed the command sequence that the variable change required. His hands steadied as the focus deepened, the shaking replaced by the specific quality of controlled precision that people find when the task is clear enough and important enough that the body aligns with it rather than working against it. The command was assembled character by character on the screen in front of him. He reviewed it. He reviewed it again. He was 12 and his head hurt, and there was a Velociraptor pressing against the glass 4 feet behind him, and he reviewed the command a 3rd time because it was correct or it was not, and if it was not, then executing it would make things worse. He executed it. The effect was not immediate, because system changes propagate through processes that are already running at their own speeds, and the propagation takes seconds rather than being instantaneous. But it was visible, first in the process list, where the modified processes showed status changes, and then in the control room, where Arnold's monitoring of the security system showed the fence control daemon returning to its designed state, the door lock coordinator returning to its designed state, the camera management process returning to its designed state. The master reset was no longer necessary. The system was clean. The fences were on full charge, including the one around the Tyrannosaurus paddock, which did not help with the Tyrannosaurus, which was not in the paddock, but which did mean that the paddock was ready to receive it when it returned or was returned. The door locks were functioning correctly, which meant the operations booth door was locked, and the lock was not going to default to open on any schedule that Nedry had written into the system. The raptor outside the booth door stopped pressing against the glass. She did not leave immediately. She moved back a step and regarded the booth and its occupants with the sustained attention that had characterized all of her interactions with the park's systems, the assessment that seemed to be adding information to a picture she was continuously constructing. Then she turned and moved back down the staircase toward the lobby, and her departure had the quality of a deliberate decision rather than an abandonment, as though she was withdrawing not because she had been stopped, but because she had completed something. In the control room, Arnold allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite relief. Relief implies an expectation of success that he had not fully permitted himself, but was something adjacent to it, a reduction in the particular tension that accumulates during extended uncertainty, a slight softening of the continuous readiness that the last hour and a half had required. The systems were clean. The children were safe for the moment. The helicopter was 20 minutes out. He reached for the radio to contact Muldoon. Muldoon was on the tour road, and Muldoon had a vehicle, and the Tyrannosaurus was somewhere between the tour road and the main complex, and that equation needed to be addressed before the helicopter arrived, because a helicopter landing in the park's main helipad while a Tyrannosaurus was at large on the island was an addition of variables that Arnold was not prepared to manage. He called Muldoon's frequency. The radio crackled. Muldoon answered on the first call, his voice the same as always, flat, direct, containing exactly the information the situation required and nothing else. The storm was beginning to ease, not dramatically. The rain was still substantial and the wind was still high, and the darkness was still complete outside every window of every building on the island. But the barometric pressure was ticking upward in the meteorological readings that Arnold had been monitoring throughout the night, the first sign that the storm's core had passed, and that what remained was the trailing edge rather than the main event. The trailing edge would continue for hours, but it would be less than what had come before, and less was something. The Unix command line that Tim was working with had been developed over a period of 20 years by a community of engineers and researchers at universities and technology companies across North America, building on foundational concepts that had emerged from Bell Labs in the late 1960s. It was, by the early 1990s, the standard operating environment for serious computational work. Not the graphical interface that was beginning to appear on personal computers, which prioritized accessibility over capability, but the text-based environment that people who needed to do things with computers actually used when they needed to do things well. Tim had encountered it through the online communities that were beginning to form around the early internet. The bulletin board systems and news groups where people who were interested in computers shared information in the flat, collegial, detail-rich way that defines communities built around shared technical enthusiasm rather than shared social identity. The specific knowledge he had was partial. He knew how to navigate the file system, how to list and examine processes, how to read and modify system configuration files. He did not know everything about the park's system, and he did not need to. What he needed was the combination of what he knew, plus what he could deduce from what was in front of him, plus the time to apply both carefully. The time was limited by the raptor at the glass, and careful was made difficult by the circumstances, and the combination of limited time and impaired carefulness was precisely the combination that produces mistakes in technical work. He was aware of this. He slowed down rather than speeding up, which is the counterintuitive response that experienced technical people know is correct, and that less experienced people often cannot execute, because the urgency drives them toward faster action rather than more careful action. The variable that he found, the shared reference in Nedry's modified processes, was named in the kind of way that programmers name things when they expect no one else to understand the code. A short, idiosyncratic string that was meaningful to its author and opaque to anyone else. Tim could not know, from the name alone, whether changing it would do what he hoped. What he could know, from examining the processes that referenced it, was that they were all security-related, that they had all been modified at the same time, and that the modification pattern was consistent with a coordinated change designed to produce a specific effect. If the variable was the shared cause of all those effects, then changing it might, not certainly but might, reverse all those effects simultaneously. This was not a certain plan. It was the best plan available. Tim changed the variable. There is a quality that the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning have that no other hours share. Not darker exactly, not quieter, but possessing of a specific depth that is partly physiological, partly psychological, and partly something that resists both categories. It is the hour at which the body is furthest from its waking state, when the processes that maintain waking consciousness are at their lowest ebb, when the boundary between what is experienced and what is dreamed is at its thinnest. For the people on Isla Nublar making their various ways through the last portion of the night, this quality was present in every action, every step, every conversation, the particular combination of exhaustion and sustained alertness that comes from having been awake and afraid for many hours, and from understanding that the fear is not yet over. Let yourself feel that depth now. The story is moving toward its ending, not with hurry, but with the natural momentum of things that have reached the point where their direction is established. The rain is less heavy. The wind has dropped below the level at which it was bending the trees and become merely wind. The darkness is the same darkness, total, tropical, complete. But it has lost the urgent quality of the storm hours and become simply the ordinary darkness of a night that has not yet reached its morning. You are warm, you are still. The events of this night are happening at a great distance and to other people, and the distance is growing with each sentence. Grant reached the visitor centre with the children at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The side entrance he came in through was one of the doors that had defaulted open during the restart and had not been manually secured in the subsequent hours, a gap in the recovery that no one had addressed because the people who would normally address it had been occupied with the more urgent aspects of the situation. The door led into a service corridor that connected to the main lobby, and Grant moved through it with the final reserves of his energy. The children ahead of him and beside him, all three of them wet and muddy and marked by the night in ways that would show for days. Hammond met them in the lobby. The meeting was not what Hammond had imagined in the months of planning that had preceded this visit. He had imagined his grandchildren arriving in the visitor centre through the main entrance at the end of a successful tour, delighted and wide-eyed, the ideal audience for the greatest show he had ever assembled. He got them back muddy and exhausted from a jungle at 3 in the morning, and the reunion was wordless for a moment. Hammond simply holding both children, not speaking. The grandfather who had built the extraordinary thing entirely temporarily absent, replaced by something simpler and older. Ellie had been working on Malcolm's leg in the second vehicle until Muldoon arrived and transported them to the visitor centre. Malcolm had continued to be lucid and talkative, which Ellie had initially regarded as a positive sign, and then, as the talkativeness persisted through transportation and examination, and the administering of the limited medical supplies available in the visitor centre's first aid kit, revised her assessment slightly, not just lucid, but in the particular state of heightened verbal facility that some people enter under sustained stress and pain, where the thoughts that are normally kept interior become exterior and the connections between ideas that normally require reflection to make become visible immediately. He was in this state genuinely interesting to listen to. He was also going to require a proper medical facility before morning. Gennaro was in the visitor centre. He had been there for some time, having reached it by his own route in the early part of the evening, a route that had involved the concrete restroom facility, and then, after the immediate danger had passed, a careful traverse of the road to the main complex in the intermission, between the Tyrannosaurus's initial attention to the vehicles and its subsequent movement toward the jungle. He was physically unhurt and experiencing the combination of relief and shame that comes from having made decisions under pressure that, reviewed afterward, did not reflect the version of oneself one aspires to be. He did not speak much. He made himself useful in practical ways, carrying things, assisting with Malcolm's transport, finding food in the kitchen that had not been disturbed by the raptors. The helicopter arrived at 3:15 in the morning. The weather had eased enough, barely but enough, for the pilot to bring the aircraft in on a careful approach to the main helipad, the landing lights cutting through the still substantial rain, the downwash creating a circle of disturbed vegetation around the pad. The specialist from InGen's mainland security division was on the helicopter, and also a medical technician, and also 2 additional security personnel whose presence Arnold had requested, and who came with the specialized equipment that contained the specific tools for managing large, uncontained predators in a controlled area. The Tyrannosaurus was located by the tracking system at 3:22. It was in the paddock. Not moved there, it had returned on its own, at some point during the night, following a route through the jungle that the cameras had not fully captured, but that the tracking data suggested was the path it had been using throughout its range in the hours since the fence went down. It was in the section of the paddock where it typically slept, which was the same section it had been in every night since it had been introduced to the paddock, the consistent home base behaviour that large animals show when their environment is stable enough to support it. The fence was on, the charge was full, the animal was asleep, or something close to it, its tracks in the mud of the paddock showing the night's travels in a record that the specialists who examined them in the morning light would read with the particular mixture of scientific fascination and professional respect that the animal consistently generated in the people whose job it was to understand it. The raptors were in the paddock, all 3 of them. This took longer to confirm, the tracking system showed them in the paddock, but tracking systems had been wrong before that night, and Muldoon did a visual check before reporting confirmation, moving carefully around the paddock perimeter with the same protocol he had been using all night, the same stillness and peripheral awareness and slow movement. The same conversation he had been having all evening with animals that were thinking about him while he thought about them. They were in the paddock. The gate mechanism showed evidence of sustained investigation, marks on the hardware that had not been there before the evening, the specific pattern of a methodical attempt on the latch that had come very close to succeeding. The gate would need to be replaced. The replacement would need to be designed with a different approach. The morning did not come quickly. The darkness held for another several hours. The island at this latitude and in this season had a long night, and the clouds of the departing storm held the dawn light out past the hour when it would otherwise have arrived. But the darkness was easier. The sounds of the island, the animal sounds, the jungle sounds, the rain sounds, the wind sounds, had softened to the register of a world that has been through something and is returning slowly to itself. The frogs were calling. A night bird was making its call somewhere in the trees beyond the facility perimeter. These were sounds of ordinariness, the baseline biological activity that the storm had briefly interrupted, and that was now resuming with the patient indifference that characterizes all living things toward the crises of other living things. Grant sat in the visitor center's lobby and was still for the first time since the afternoon. The children were with Hammond. Malcolm was with the medical technician. Ellie was with Arnold, reviewing the system's status with the methodical thoroughness of a scientist who will want to understand exactly what happened before she can properly consider what it means. Grant sat in the lobby and looked at the mural on the wall. The painted dinosaurs, the artistic rendition of Cretaceous life that the park's designers had commissioned for the entrance experience, the formal and deliberate representation of the world that the island was supposed to recreate. The mural had been painted by an artist who had worked from fossil reference material and scientific consultation, and who had done an excellent job in the terms available to someone making art from absence. The animals were accurate as far as accuracy was possible, the plants were plausible, the light was warm and the colours were vivid, and the scene suggested a world that was grand and fertile and somehow comprehensible, a world that could be visited and understood and appreciated. It was beautiful work. It was also, like all representations, a simplification, a translation of something vast and wild and fundamentally indifferent into something that could be hung on a wall and walked past and seen. Grant thought about the Brachiosaurus in the afternoon light. The specific memory of it, not the fear, not the crisis, but the afternoon, the moment before, the animal in the paddock turning its head to look at the vehicles with that expression that was not quite indifferent and not quite curious, but occupied a space between those things that had no name in any human vocabulary. The size of it, the reality of it, the absolute material, undeniable presence of a living thing that had no business being alive in this century and was nevertheless alive, turning its head in the golden light, making the sound that no film or recording had ever captured correctly. This was the thing that the crisis had not changed and could not change, the fact of that afternoon, the fact of those animals existing in that place at that time, alive and real and extraordinary in ways that exceeded every attempt to contain the experience in language or image or any other medium. Whatever had gone wrong, and much had gone wrong, and the reckoning for what had gone wrong was going to be extensive and uncomfortable, and would involve conversations that many people would find painful. The animals had been real. The wonder had been real. The impossible had happened, and the record of the impossible happening was inside the people who had been there for it, unremovable and permanent. The first hint of dawn came at 5:48 in the morning, a slight lightening of the eastern sky that was visible through the visitor centre's eastern windows as a shift from black to deep charcoal. Not sunrise, the clouds were still too heavy for that, but the sky acknowledging the sun's approach, the world beginning the turn toward light that it makes every morning without fail, regardless of what the night has contained. Hammond stood at the eastern window and watched it. He had aged in the night. This is not dramatic language, but simple observation, the particular quality of a person who has come through something that has rearranged their understanding of the world and who has not yet had enough distance from the rearrangement to know what it means. He watched the sky lighten. He was not thinking about the future of the park, for perhaps the first time since the island had been acquired. He was thinking about the amber on his desk, the one he kept closest, the one with the best specimen, the gnat, trapped mid-movement, suspended in the golden matrix with its wings half raised and its legs positioned exactly as they had been at the moment of capture. 75 million years old, still and perfect and entirely itself, unchanged by the millions of years of world that had accumulated around it. He thought about what it had cost to retrieve what was inside it. Not in money. He knew the money figure, had always known it, had never found it troubling. But in something else. In the world's particular indifference to human plans. In the gap between what he had intended and what the night had produced. In the specific and irreducible fact that the things he had made were alive, and that alive things were not, in the end, subject to his intentions or anyone's, and that this was perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all. Not that he had brought them back, but that in bringing them back he had made something that now exceeded him entirely. The medical technician who arrived on the helicopter was thorough and direct, and had clearly been briefed on the nature of the situation in a way that allowed her to begin treatment without the delay that would otherwise have been required for intake and assessment. Malcolm's leg was the priority, not life-threatening but serious enough that the 2 hours remaining before they could be transported off the island required proper management rather than the improvised field treatment Ellie had provided. She worked with the compact efficiency of someone who has had to deliver medical care in challenging conditions, laying out her equipment on the visitor centre lobby floor with the careful organisation of someone who knows exactly where everything is and why. Hammond spent the early morning hours in a combination of practical coordination and something more internal that he was not fully willing to acknowledge. The practical coordination involved calls to InGen's management, to the helicopter service, to the mainland facility where the additional response teams were being assembled. It involved reviewing the status of each of the park's animal populations and the containment infrastructure, with the specific goal of establishing what was intact and what required immediate attention. It involved the formal acknowledgement, transmitted through InGen's communication channels, to the regulatory bodies that needed to know that the island had experienced a containment incident and that the situation was being managed. All of these things he did with the efficiency and clarity of someone who's been moving through crises for a long time and has developed a set of practices for doing so. What the coordination did not address, and what the morning hours were therefore also containing for Hammond, was the question of what came next for the park itself. Not the operational question. That had an answer, which was an extensive period of assessment and repair and system redesign before any resumption of operations could be considered. The deeper question, whether the park would resume operations at all, whether the night's events constituted a temporary setback in a project that was fundamentally viable, or whether they constituted evidence that the fundamental viability was not there. Hammond had always understood how to make the case for the park. He was beginning, for the first time, to understand how to hear the case against it. Grant found a chair in the lobby that faced the mural and sat in it as the morning light began to reach the eastern windows. He was not thinking in any productive sense. His brain was doing what exhausted brains do, which is to process the recent past in the fragmentary, non-sequential way of post-emergency cognition. The pieces of the night coming back not in order, but in the order that their emotional weight assigned them. The Brachiosaurus, the fence, Tim's weight on his back, the sound of the jungle at 3 a.m, the lights of the visitor centre appearing through the trees. He sat with these in the growing light and did not try to organise them into a narrative because the narrative could wait and the sitting could not. There is a story that runs beneath the story of Jurassic Park, quieter and longer and less dramatic than the night of the storm, that concerns itself with what the island was after the people left. And the people did leave. The park was closed in the days following the storm, the remaining staff evacuated, the animals left to their own resources in the paddocks and the jungle, the facilities shuttered and the fences maintained for a period by automated systems, and then maintained less reliably, as the automated systems aged without human oversight, and as the jungle began to reclaim the clearings and paths that human hands had made. The island did not go silent. This is important. In the popular imagination, an abandoned place falls into a certain kind of quiet, the quiet of absence, of ending, of all activity having ceased. But abandonment by humans is not abandonment by life. The animals that were there when the humans left were still there, and they had not been waiting for the humans to return before they resumed being alive. The raptors tested the paddock fences until the fences failed, which they did, over years of weather and neglect and the mechanical attrition that all machines undergo without maintenance. The Tyrannosaurus ranged its territory. The Brachiosaurus fed from the trees that had grown taller without pruning, reaching canopy heights that the paddock designers had not planned for because they had not planned for the paddocks to operate without keepers. something else happened too. The gap-filling sequences in the dinosaur's DNA, the frog sequences that Wu had used to close the regions where the original genetic code had degraded beyond use, had introduced, in several species, the capacity for sex change. Not immediately, not dramatically. This was not a spectacle visible to any observer, but a gradual biochemical process, the expression of a genetic potential under specific environmental conditions, specifically the condition of a same-sex population. The animals had been designed to be all female, and in the absence of males, the biology found the path it had been given the tools to find. The raptors were breeding within 18 months of the humans' departure. The evidence of this would not be confirmed for some years, but the event itself happened when it happened, independent of anyone's knowledge or plans, in exactly the way that the life on that island had been happening since the first embryo was brought to term, according to its own logic, along the paths that the chemistry and the physics and the millions of years of evolutionary selection had laid down for it. This is the fact that everything else in the Jurassic Park story is ultimately a frame for. Not the system failure, not the human drama, not the corporate ambition, or the mathematical modelling, or even the extraordinary science that made any of it possible. The fundamental fact is simpler and older than all of those things. Life persists. It does not persist because it is noble or resilient in any abstract sense. It persists because it is built from processes that maintain themselves under conditions that cannot be predicted in advance. Processes that have been refined over billions of years of the world trying to stop them from working, and the world failing, every single time, until the one time it succeeded, which is the time we call extinction, the end of a lineage, the irreversible silence of a form of being that once was and is now not. The dinosaurs on Isla Nublar had been brought back from exactly that silence. Whatever else was true about how it was done, the what was extraordinary, would remain extraordinary regardless of the outcome of the night described in this story or of the subsequent decades of consequences. The silence had been broken. The form of being had, however briefly and however imperfectly, returned. The world that had enclosed their absence for 65 million years had been opened, and the things inside it had stepped out, blinking in light they had never personally known, into a world that had no preparation for them. They were not prepared for the world either. This is the symmetry at the heart of the story. Neither side of the equation was ready for the other. Hammond's Park had not been ready for the intelligence of the raptors, or the indifference of the Tyrannosaurus, or the frog sequences in the genome, or the hurricane-force storm, or the human error embedded in the person he had trusted to build his systems. The animals had not been ready for the fences or the tranquilizer guns or the concrete or the climate-controlled genetics laboratory, or the fact that the food they ate and the space they moved in and the air they breathed had all been arranged for them by beings they could not smell or hear or see through any sensory system they possessed. The negotiation between those two unreadiness states, the human world's unreadiness for what it had created and the animals' unreadiness for the world they had been created into, is the story that continues after the evacuation helicopter lifts off from the main helipad in the early morning, carrying 7 survivors and 1 person who will not be going home. It continues in the courts and the conference rooms and the scientific papers and the regulatory hearings. It continues on the island, where the animals continue to live and adapt and breed, where the fences slowly fail and the jungle reclaims the paths and the visitor centre's carefully designed landscape merges gradually into the surrounding forest until the line between them is lost. What does it mean to have done what was done on that island? This is the question that haunts every person who was there, not the operational question of what went wrong, though that question has its own extensive literature, but the deeper question of meaning. Had the park been a mistake? Malcolm would say yes, would say it with mathematical precision, with the patience of someone who had seen the outcome predicted in the structure of the system before the outcome occurred. We would not say yes or no, would say that the question was too simple for the reality, that what had been done was not a single thing but a series of things, some of which were mistakes and some of which were extraordinary, and some of which were both simultaneously. Grant would say that the question itself was wrong, that the animals existed and that existence was not a mistake, and that the question of whether they should have been created was rendered moot by the fact of their creation. Hammond, in the years after the night of the storm, would not speak publicly about the park in terms that acknowledged failure. This was partly the character of the man, the man who had not been born to accept defeat and had lived a life that confirmed this, and partly something more interesting, more complicated than mere obstinacy. He had seen the Brachiosaurus in the afternoon light. He had watched it from the window of the visitor centre, and had felt at that moment the same thing that Grant had felt and Ellie had felt, and even Malcolm had felt despite himself. The absolute reality of something impossible made possible. The world expanded beyond the boundaries it had been given. The past returned to a present that had believed it gone forever. That feeling was not a mistake. That feeling was not diminished by the storm or the fence failure or the raptors or the Dilophosaurus in the jungle. It was a real thing. It happened. It could not be undone. The island continues. This is what islands do. They persist in the ocean, indifferent to the dramas played out on their surfaces, their geology unchanged by the events of any particular night in any particular century. The volcanic rock is still there, dark and ancient. The jungle has continued its slow work of reclamation. The species composition of the plant communities has shifted further from the designed state, and toward the state that the actual conditions of the island support, and the animals that move through those plant communities are different from the animals that were introduced there. Different because they have had years now to adapt, to learn the island, to develop the behavioural repertoire of animals that have a home rather than a facility. There is a particular sound that the island makes in the morning when the storm has passed and the rain is light and the birds are starting their first calls and the light is beginning to penetrate the canopy from the east. It is not a sound that any human ear has heard in several years, because the island is not currently accessible to humans by any legal or practical means, and the few people who have passed near it by sea report only what can be seen from the water, which is the jungle and the rock and the occasional large shape moving at the tree line, patient and unhurried and entirely itself in the world it has made from what it was given. That sound is the world from before. It is the sound of the Cretaceous, or something like it, something assembled from fragments and gap-filled and imperfect, as all reconstructions are, but real, alive, present, making its sounds in its jungle on its island in an ocean that has been here since long before any of this began and will be here long after all of it is resolved. That sound is the most extraordinary thing. That sound is the thing that the night of the storm could not take away and cannot take away, the irreversible fact of it, the proof that the silence was not permanent, that the past was not entirely past, that the amber had given back, however briefly and however chaotically, something of what it had held for 65 million years. In the visitor centre lobby, the mural is still on the wall, faded now, the colours dulled by years without climate control, the painted surface beginning to peel at the edges where moisture has worked its way under. But the animals in the mural are still visible, the Brachiosaurus, the Triceratops, the pterosaurs in the painted sky, all of them rendered with the care of a painter who believed they were making something that people would look at for a long time, and they were right. The painted dinosaurs look out at the empty lobby, at the dust and the growing plants coming through the broken windows, at the light that comes and goes with the weather, at the ordinary eternal drama of the world continuing without them. They are not sad paintings. They are not triumphant. They are what they are, the record of an attempt, the evidence that something was here, the mark that things leave when they have passed through a place and are gone, or not quite gone, somewhere between the past and the present, between the preserved and the alive in the space that amber opens, suspended, perfect, and endlessly becoming. The investigation that followed the crisis produced a document that ran to several hundred pages, examining every decision and system failure that had contributed to the night's events. The document was thorough and careful, and had been prepared by people who were genuinely trying to understand what had happened rather than to assign blame, and its conclusions were not simple. The failure was not any single decision, but the accumulation of many decisions, each individually defensible in the context in which it was made, collectively producing an outcome that none of the individual decisions had been designed to produce. This is the characteristic failure mode of complex systems, not a single point of failure but a cascade of decisions that, in combination with specific external conditions that could not have been precisely predicted, produced a result that was not predictable from any individual decision in isolation. The document said this in the careful language of systems analysis, and its recommendations addressed the systemic issues rather than the individual ones, and the recommendations were implemented in the subsequent period with a thoroughness that represented genuine learning from the night's events. Dr. Wu's career continued after Isla Nublar, in ways that the storm's aftermath did not determine but that were shaped by it. He continued to work in genetic engineering, the technical problems that had occupied him for a decade at InGen having given way to related problems at other institutions and other companies. The questions that remained with him, not professionally, not in the papers he wrote, but personally, in the ongoing conversation he had with himself about what the work meant, were not primarily scientific questions. They were questions about the gap between what is technically achievable and what is wise to achieve, between what can be done and what should be done, between the genuine wonder of a newly hatched animal and the genuine difficulty of the world that the animal was being hatched into. These questions do not have answers in the way that scientific questions have answers. They persist. They become part of the texture of a life. The island's fate was determined by a combination of legal and political processes that occupied the years following the crisis, and that resulted, after extensive litigation and negotiation, in its designation as a restricted zone, a protected area, not in the conventional sense of a nature reserve, but in the sense of a place where human presence was restricted, for reasons that the legal language described as safety, and that the scientific language described as ongoing study. The designation effectively preserved the island in the state the evacuation had left it, intact, inhabited by the animals that had been introduced there, managed at a distance by monitoring systems that did not require human presence on the island itself. The animals continued to live. The population dynamics continued to evolve. The jungle continued its reclamation of the human-built spaces. What is it worth to know that somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, on an island that is visible from the ocean only as a dark mass against the lighter dark of the horizon, there are animals moving through a jungle at night that were not alive 65 million years ago and are alive now, not worth in any commercial sense, not worth in the moral sense that philosophers argue about, but worth in the simpler sense of what it means to you personally, to you, here, in the warmth of wherever you are, to know that the world contains this, that the amber gave back, that the silence was broken, that something lost was found and placed, however imperfectly, however briefly, however chaotically, back into the living world. The worth of that is not calculable. It is simply there, like the amber, like the island, like the sound of the jungle in the dark that no human ear is currently hearing, but that is nevertheless being made. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The rain has stopped, or it is stopping. You can hear it slowing, the intervals between drops growing longer, the roof sound thinning from a continuous rush to something intermittent, something that lets the other sounds back in. The frogs, the soft movement of air through leaves, the creak of a tree somewhere in the dark. You're very warm. Whatever you're lying on has accepted the weight of you completely, and your breathing has slowed to a rhythm that your body chose rather than your mind directing it. This is correct. This is how it should be. The night is doing what nights do, which is to carry you away from the events of the day into something quieter and more ancient, into the hours when the body repairs itself, and the mind sorts what it has taken in, and the things that seemed urgent become, in the dark, merely the events of a day that has concluded. The island is somewhere in the Pacific. The jungle is wet and green. The animals are moving through it according to their own understanding, their own biology, their own 65 million years of preparation for exactly the conditions they inhabit. They are not thinking about you. They are not thinking about the night of the storm, which is decades in the past now, which is a story that belongs to the amber of memory, fixed, contained, preserved in exactly the form it took when it was caught. You are part of the world that came after, the world that found the amber and understood what it contained and reached inside it, the world that made the extraordinary attempt and lived through the consequences and kept going. The world that gets up the next morning, whenever the next morning comes, and makes its breakfast and goes outside and looks at the ordinary sky and is still, somehow, despite everything, astonished by what is possible. Let that astonishment be here with you now, soft and quiet as you drift. Let the jungle sounds be far and the warmth be close. Let your breath come and go without direction. Let the rain finish its slow retreat. Let the dark do its work. You are safe. The night holds everything. The island is beautiful in the rain and the dark, and the animals on it are alive and real and extraordinary. And the world is older and stranger and more patient than any plan made inside it. And you are a very small and very precious part of all of that. And you do not need to do anything right now except allow yourself to sleep. Sleep now. The story is finished. Everything that needed to happen has happened. The morning is on its way. You will meet it rested and whole, and it will be full of the ordinary astonishments that each morning carries. The light on the window, the smell of whatever the day brings, the persistent, irreducible fact of being here and alive in a world that is, despite everything, still making room for wonder. Sleep. The amber holds, the jungle breathes, the dark is yours. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.